first time I saw the original Kong was in New Zealand on TV, a Friday night, and I would have been about 8 or 9 years old, probably about 1970. It was King Kong that actually started my love of fantasy and science fiction. So before that, even though I'd been making little Super 8 movies, they were mainly World War II films, and Kong was one of those defining moments in your life where everything changed after I saw Kong. For starters, it gave me a real sense of what I wanted to do as a career, which wasn't actually to become a director, it was to become a special effects person, because what King Kong does, I think, if you're of the right frame of mind, is it totally inspires you to think about the trickery of films. It's the wonderful escapist use of special effects. And so after seeing King Kong, I started to experiment with stop motion. I made little puppets. I used to animate them with my parents' Super 8 camera. And I was, I just didn't really know anything about it particularly. But within maybe 3 or 4 years, I found Famous Monsters of Filmland, which is Forry Ackerman's magazine. Hugely inspirational. On every page it had photos of monsters, and sometimes you got the absolute motherlode, which was the behind-the-scenes photographs of Willis O'Brien or Ray Harryhausen at work. I mean, they were the photos that I used to crave for, the ones showing the guys actually bending over the table animating, because they were the little glimpse behind the curtain of how this stuff was done. Ray Harryhausen obviously became an influence too, because if you start getting interested in Kong and stop motion, you gradually learn about Ray Harryhausen, and I learned about his movies. Seventh Voyage of Sinbad was re-released in the early 1970s, and I got to see Seventh Voyage at the cinema in colour, which was great, because our TVs were just black and white in those days, which was fine for Kong, not so good for Sinbad. I think the solitary nature of the stop-motion animator, which was part of the mystique of O'Brien or Harryhausen, was that they would disappear into their garage all by themselves and produce these magical sequences. I think that appealed to me too. The fact that I wasn't going to be, dealing with 200 people. I was just going to be able to do it all by myself. But it explains why my movies have a lot of special effects in them. I mean, I am a frustrated special effects guy, basically. When I was about 12, 2 or 3 years after I saw Kong, I decided I was going to do a remake of it. In my burst of excitement, I made a little puppet, stop-motion puppet of Kong with wire, joints. I decided I was going to start, the first sequence I was going to really have a go at doing was the Empire State Building. So I built the top of the Empire State Building out of cardboard. See, I didn't even bother painting the back of it, because I thought we'd only be filming it from the front, so I...
Conserved your resources.
Yeah, I conserved my silver paint, must have been in short supply. I got my mother to give me an old sheet that I stretched it on the wall. I pinned it up onto my bedroom wall and stretched it, and I painted the cyclorama of a volcano in a sort of Skull Island prehistoric kind of world to go behind the dinosaurs. And I never got around to building an aeroplane, actually, for attacking Kong. I got the Empire State Building, then I got Kong. I did some little bit of test shooting of him moving around. I got so far and just realised it was never going to be what I was imagining it to be in my mind. And so I gave up on it eventually and moved on to other things. I mean, I still kept doing stop motion though. I did a thing for a school filmmaking competition when I was about 15 or 16 that had a Cyclops monster in it, or sort of something that looked like Harryhausen's Cyclops. One eye and a horn. It was very much like Ray's Cyclops. So I certainly kept on doing stop motion, but I never really got any further with my remake of Kong, unfortunately. While we were making The Frighteners, we were working with Universal on that particular movie, and we had a call from our executive on The Frighteners, Lenny Kornberg. I think they were seeing dailies of The Frighteners and they were liking what they were seeing. And Lenny called us and said, there's a couple of horror movies that the studio is wanting to remake, and would either of them interest me? And one was The Creature from the Black Lagoon, which I sort of didn't get too excited about, and the other one was King Kong, which I did get very excited about. And I said to Lenny, because I'd never mentioned Kong to him at all, and I said, you realise this is my favourite film? And he said, oh, really? And it was interesting because I was also aware that Universal in years earlier had attempted to remake King Kong in 1975. When Dino De Laurentiis was doing his version for Paramount, I think it was, Universal were developing a competing version of Kong. So I was reading about that. I remember looking in one of the very first issues of Starlog magazine I ever bought, and they had an article about the competing Kongs in 1975. And so it was weird to be talking to somebody at Universal and basically to being offered to now pick up the reins and do what Universal had failed to do 20 years earlier. And so I was excited. We had to get The Frighteners finished first, which we did.
We're all about to go on a big holiday and just sort of, relax after The Frighteners. And so Pete sort of, obviously had another project in the wings and let us all know. So, we were all coming back to work on that.
Everybody in the facility sat down and we all read the script. A fun script, but different in tone. A little bit more sort of smart and a little bit more kind of jokey.
It was sort of flippant, very Hollywood, it had the sort of same tone as The Mummy, I guess.
When I saw The Mummy, I thought, did they read the King Kong script? It was almost that sort of, classic sort of Hollywood adventure feeling kind of film.
I remember initially the first time we come across Jack, he's a World War I fighter pilot, and he and his buddy are up in their biplanes doing baseball practice, chucking a ball and hitting it back to each other while they're flying along.
I think the Red Baron turned up at one stage.
And so I got to do a sort of a World War I dogfight sequence, which I'd put in there because I'd always wanted to do a World War I dogfight scene, still do.
And was, sort of upper class English kind of, character. She was the daughter of a lord who was a boffiny archaeologist type.
They were on a dig in Sumatra.
And that's how they sort of are introduced to the concept of this ape god and this ancient sort of civilization. And then, Carl Denham's there trying to make a movie. We
imagined him to be much more stern and more of a overt villain. There were elements of our 1996 script that survived. The Brontosaurus stampede was pretty much exactly as written in 1996. The Tyrannosaurus Rex fight with the 3 T-Rexes was again something that we had planned for the 1996 version. The sequence in New York with the Empire State Building at the end was there, but it was somewhat different because we had Jack Driscoll basically commandeering an old airplane and taking off and flying around the Empire State Building to try to protect Kong. And we had the other naval planes attacking him and Jack Driscoll in his plane trying to get in their way and trying to block them and trying to sort of throw them off their aim, and he was sort of flying around as well.
It kind of took the essence of Kong and reimagined it. Lots of different extra story points and different characterizations.
During that period of time, we did a lot of pre-production artwork. Richard Taylor and his gang at Weta Workshop did a lot of maquettes for dinosaurs, for Kong. We did many, drawings.
Because our design department was all very green and, very young, boundless enthusiasm, but not a lot of experience, Bernie Wrightson was brought on board.
Bernie's a great comic book artist and is a superb visual storyteller with the way that he draws. And so I thought that Bernie's style would be really interesting to mesh Kong and Bernie Wrightson together.
Our design team started a huge round of conceptual art, first through illustration and then through 3D sculptural maquetting.
We were basically all just having a go at the different dinosaurs. So yeah, I was having a go at everything, really. There was pet creatures, there was dinosaurs, and Kong himself. But it was sort of evened out at that stage. Everyone sort of had a go at everything.
We designed a very classic, very Harryhausen-esque brontosaur. Similar to the one that Ray had done for 1 million years BC. I always thought it was actually, quite a similar looking brontosaur, a very, very classic design.
Kong was a funny one because I don't think we really, in the 96 version, resolved Kong. We were getting close, and we definitely went down some really strange avenues, some really interesting looks that you wouldn't have necessarily thought of.
What he was back then was a gorilla in his prime, this giant, majestic beast. There was a little bit of scarification and that sort of thing, but he essentially was this really majestic creature.
At that point, we had still perceived that we would have to do Kong with animatronic components.
We were going to do the classic Kong's mechanical hand like they have done in the previous versions, and I know that Weta Workshop had got pretty far advanced with designing and building a mechanical hand rig. We also had a sequence with some crocodiles that attacked a sinking car at one stage, and we were going to be building mechanical animatronic crocodiles that were going to be sort of busting in the windows of the slowly sinking vehicle.
But probably the largest body of work that we started was in 1996. Animatics created digitally were not a reality at this point, or they certainly weren't in our scope of work. So the only way that we could think to pre-visualize the movie in filmic images was to do it with stop animation. Can you imagine? So we set about and in fact made all of the creatures as stop animation armatures. We made 8 brontosaurs, we made the T-Rexes, we made the carnosaurs, the raptors, we made all the sailors, all with stop animation armatures. We sculpted them, fiberglass molded them and ran them in foam. When we had all the brontosaurs lined up, it was quite a spectacular array of critters.
I also thought there was something nice about prevising in stop motion, even though the movie was going to be completely computer generated, that it gave us a first pass in the old-fashioned technique. So we'd sort of somehow, that flavour would be inherited by the finished film itself.
About half the people who were working on the show at Digital at that time were working on the digital build of 1933 period New York. And that turned out to be really useful because when we kicked off with King Kong in 2003, when we got back onto that project, the first thing we did was we unloaded that low-resolution New York dataset, and that became our previs environment for pre-visualizing all the New York scenes in King Kong. So what was going to be a hero asset in 1996, 97 became a previs asset for the 2003 version, which I think indicates the degree to which the complexity of the work that we were doing had progressed over the years.
We had tools, don't get me wrong, but they certainly weren't as intuitive as what we're doing now. Back then it was researching looks, doing the modelling of the biplanes themselves, animation tests, environment tests, crash tests, that kind of thing. There was one dogfight test that we did that put these planes in downtown Wellington. It was like a helicopter fly-past shot, and you've got these planes just going at it, burning, catching on fire, shooting buildings, bombs are going off. Good stuff.
Being able to take a digital plane and crash it into the ground and have that look believable was a very complex task that we really had to do a big R&D project on.
This is actually in the days before like pixel tracking or motion tracking or even something like Shake. So all of our matching the buildings happened very laboriously. It was a more painful world doing visual effects in those days.
We never got anywhere close to developing a final Kong puppet or a final CG design. By January 97, which was about 6 or 7 months after we'd gotten underway, we had the plug pulled on us suddenly.
As I understand it, which I think is, as everyone else understands it, Universal got cold feet because there was Godzilla and Mighty Joe Young due to come out that year. It's another movie about a big gorilla and another movie about a monster terrorizing New York City.
So Universal were looking at being the 3rd place out of 3 monster movies. And so in the beginning of 97, it just started to feel wrong. And within a few weeks, it just spiraled downhill and was sort of over and done. Blink, finished, bang.
I remember Charlie McClellan, the visual effects producer, he'd obviously got the call, he sort of came in and he had the schedule all up on the board and he just grabbed the schedule and just ripped it off.
Yeah, we kind of, went round to one of our colleagues' place and drowned our sorrows a little bit and tried to put a brave face on it.
Yeah, there were tears. Some people were really quite upset.
People had become very emotionally involved. For many of us, it was our first big film project, and so we invested ourselves completely in it.
Back then, we had sculpted this wonderful maquette of Kong fighting these 3 dinosaurs, this really big model that we gave as a gift to the studio. It was like one of my trips to LA to have a script meeting. I took this big model. I lugged this thing across in a carton and assembled it in the hotel in LA and then took it to Universal and presented it to them as a thank you at one of our meetings. And then when they killed the movie, I called them up and said, "Send me my model back." And we got it back, and it's a model that's been sitting in the lobby of Weta Workshop for the last 8 or 9 years. And everybody that came to the workshop would go, "Oh, wow, look at this." And it was always a slightly bittersweet feeling because I look at it and it was always represented the film that didn't happen, so I was really pleased to finally be able to get that T-Rex fight out of my system because that one had certainly been stuck in my head for quite a long time.
What happened when we first Just when King Kong got canned, is that Pete immediately asked us to start doing some design work for The Hobbit.
Something was up. We didn't know what exactly, but it then changed to Lord of the Rings, which then was suddenly like, okay, how do we do this?
And so I actually started storyboarding The Lord of the Rings in August 1997.
And we all know what happened next.
It's arguable that Lord of the Rings would ever have been made if we had made Kong, and but more importantly, we weren't equipped to make it. Back then, we didn't have the experiences that we had garnered off Lord of the Rings, nor did we have the computer power and sophistication that we have today.
Weta managed to develop its skills quite a lot during the course of making The Lord of the Rings, and it prepared itself for the monster that was Kong.
And hindsight's a wonderful thing. We just learnt so much from the Lord of the Rings experience that we were able to bring back into Kong.
I think things always happen for a reason, so I think it was possibly a good thing that nothing happened. I think it would have been a different film then. I don't think it would have been as emotive, and I don't think that the story would have evolved as much as it did.
But for me, it was always unfinished business. It was a dream that I'd wanted since I was a kid that had been unfulfilled in a way that wasn't particularly pleasant back in 1996. And I'd always feel a little pang of disappointment that that was the film that I wish I could have made that I never did get made. It was strange during Lord of the Rings because Weta Workshop had all of our Kong models from 1996, and they were all up on a shelf in the sculpting room. And so all the way through Lord of the Rings for like 6 or 7 years, I'd go in for numerous meetings into the sculpting room, and I'd always step in the door and be reminded of Kong. So I did spend 6 or 7 years being kind of tormented and tortured by looking at all these things of the film that never happened.
And, you know, I mean, in all honesty, I thought Kong would never get made, and Pete was just adamant, we're going to do it one day. You know, there was never a day, you know, that you know, he even sort of considered that we were never going to do it.
So it was really nice when we got a phone call from Universal asking us if we were interested in revisiting King Kong. That phone call happened while we were on Two Towers.
I think Peter gave us the first intimation that the show was going to go about midway through Return of the King.
Sorry we're late. We were just having a look at Real Tuna. I believe we're supposed to finish it for a premiere soon.
At the point that we were starting to work on Kong, we still had the majority of Return of the King shots to deliver. You know, we would have only had a handful of shots finalled on film 3 at that point.
We're in the thick of it. It was just Return of the King, Return of the King. The thought that anything else was going on was mind-boggling.
We were exhausted. We were all pretty tired coming out of Lord of the Rings, and then we went straight into this.
Most of the people who worked with us on Lord of the Rings carried through. It was just that same old team crashing along, you know, and it was great.
The film is really divided into 3 segments, if you like, which is pre-production, production, which is literally shooting with the cameras, and then post-production. And really the most valuable one, in terms of just needing as many minutes in the day, as many days in the week that you can, is really pre-production. Because if you go into the shoot with your pre-production done properly, it's going to be a smooth, problem-free shoot.
The thing that became painfully apparent right from the start is that we'd had this luxury of this 3 years of pre-production on Rings. With Kong, we had a show that was in many ways as complex as the whole of the trilogy, but we had pretty much 2 years from start to finish to get the whole thing done. So we had to hit the ground running.
Kong just went bang. You're racing, boys, you know, and we were racing.
One of the first things we did on Kong when we got free to work on it after the release of Return of the King was to visit New York. I mean, it was something that was pretty essential, obviously, to King Kong. We had a wonderful trip up to the Empire State Building.
March the 4th, 2004, we're in the Empire State Building. Pete said, you know, it's an opportunity to take Naomi up and get her familiar with what it feels like to be at the top of the Empire State Building, because next time she does this, she'll be on a blue screen stage.
So we got special permission from the folks at the Empire State Building to take us right the way to the very top.
So coming out into it's very still morning down below, and up here quite still breeze.
We went there early to watch the sun come over the horizon, just as it does in our film as well.
The sun's just...
Wow. Wow, beautiful dawn here.
Now you go down to the street, they can't see that yet. Was it 6 minutes? 6 minute difference? 6 minutes.
We also actually climbed inside the light tower that sticks up the very top of the building.
Wow. So cool. Wow.
And details and elements of that room were changed, so it was interesting to recognise all those changes that had happened.
And this wouldn't have had a doorway, it wouldn't have had a... The ladder was here. The ladder was here, just the ladder. And there was a hatch door right here, over there.
And then he took us right up into the central shaft and up to this room that you opened the door and there was this balcony. God, there's a balcony. And out onto the ledge. If you're going to get vertigo, this is where you're going to get it.
I was following Naomi out, and I remember her white knuckles grabbing hold of the building as we went out on there, because, man, talk about vertigo.
I wish I was Spider-Man right now. No.
Originally, it was quite a deep balcony, so no one could fall over, but they'd put this grating in so that people could do whatever they do with the telecom mast.
So the ledge, it doesn't even feel like it comes up to your waist. It's like lower, and it's like you're so convinced you're going to fall off.
It feels a lot better.
And then we went up into the cone, into the very summit of the Empire State Building.
And interestingly, on the inside of the cone, a lot of the workers, the maintenance people, what have you, had signed their names. And Peter signed his name on the inside as well, so it'll be there for all time, hopefully.
There we go. There we go.
And then we were speaking to this guy who was showing us around and said, you know, what is up the top there? And he said, oh, well, you know, we're not allowed to take anyone up there. But, you know, maybe in this case I can make an exception. I went, well, we got to do it.
And Peter, Dan and I braved the elements and climbed up through this tiny little hatchway to stand on the very top of the cone of the Empire State Building, which very few people had done.
Wouldn't bring too many more people up here.
That's only us.
The floor is not solid.
Okay.
The very top of the tower now has this great big communication mast going up it, and it felt very unhealthy because of the microwaves sort of homing in on that building.
And I was filming with my video camera, and I suddenly realised that the zoom was electronically pulsing in and out, in and out, in and out. And I realised that all of these microwaves that were coming from these antennas had suddenly taken control of my video camera, and I thought, God, if this is what's happening to my video camera, what's it doing to my body, you know? And so I got down from there pretty damn quickly.
But it was thrilling, because it's great to know that we're one of just a very few people who climbed up there.
You wonder about the ultimate use of trips like that, apart from informing design and the look of the film. I mean, creatively, they're really amazing too, because they are where ideas spring from.
Was the ladder that goes up along the windows? I think it was. Now that's really have to check the pictures.
In the movie, we had to get Anne up to the top, and in our screenplay, she was just going to run up the stairs. And Naomi said, hey, I could go up the side of the building on the ladder.
I think she would be forced to use that. She wouldn't want to lose him, like lose sight of him by going inside.
That would be pretty cool, wouldn't it?
If we hadn't been on that tour of the Empire State Building, probably would have never been in the movie. So you get these little bonus treats that you don't actually expect when you go on a recce like that.
Then we scooted across town and jumped in a helicopter, and then did a fly past of the Empire State Building and of the approaches to it, like across Central Park and things like that.
So we were able to literally, fly the flight path to some degree of the biplanes at the end, and I was filming with a DV camera.
And so he really was just figuring out what some of those great shots were at the end of the movie.
We spent 2 or 3 days in New York, and the biggest thrill for me, in some degree, was actually visiting Fay Ray. And with Naomi, meeting her, there was this really playful competition.
Peter, of course, introduced me as the girl that was playing Anne Darrow, and she was like, "I'm Anne Darrow." There is only one Anne Darrow.
She was toying with us because she definitely had a very mischievous sense of humour. But what was interesting for Naomi, because she was playing an actress from 1933, was that she was able to ask a lot of questions about the profession of acting in the 1930s.
A series of questions were thrown at her, and she would just sit there, and then we'd think, oh, right, okay, maybe we've overwhelmed her with too many questions. And then she'd go, no, 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 and no to everything you just said. It was like, wow, it was just the way she said it. It was like old-fashioned dialogue, I don't know.
Even though she was 96 years old, she was still an actress at heart. Because at one stage, Naomi's walking across the living room, the apartment we were in, and Faye suddenly says, "How much do you weigh?"
And I said, oh gosh, I don't know, Faye, 110, 115, I'm not sure. And she went, I weigh 100, 99 in the morning.
And that was a wonderful evening, very, very emotional. I was just couldn't believe that I was meeting Fay Ray, and she was wonderfully gracious.
He was just telling her how he was in love with her from the moment he saw her in King Kong, and how wonderful it was to actually meet her. And he had a kind of emotional moment, and it was really sweet.
And then at the end of the night, a wonderful thing happened. She grabbed Naomi's hands and she said to her quietly, but I could just hear it, she said, "Anne Darrow was in very safe hands, my dear, very safe hands."
And that sort of just really moved me. I felt like, wow, okay, I've got her permission. It was a real great high note to end on.
I actually met with Faye 2 or 3 times after that initial meeting, because ever since 1995, when we'd written our first screenplay, I just thought it would be wonderful to have Faye saying the lines, "It was beauty killed the beast." And I asked her if she'd be interested in doing a cameo, and she said no. And the very last time I met with her, she whispered to me, "Never say never." But it wasn't really to be, because she died a couple of months after that last meeting. So, with Fay Ray's death today, I guess it sort of puts a very final close on what was a dream of mine. It was been a dream of some 7 or 8 years, ever since we were going to do King Kong in 1996, to have her sort of do a cameo. And we came very close, and for the worst possible reasons, it's obviously not going to happen now.
He really was looking forward to working with her, and even though it would have been a really small part, it would have meant a lot to him.
Fay Ray to me was like almost my first crush, I guess. And it was actually overwhelming to meet her. I absolutely value the experience that I had meeting her and getting to know her a bit. And, that far outweighs the importance of having her do a cameo in our movie. I mean, at least I got to meet her, and we'll always be grateful for that chance. I think it's good. I think when Anne comes out here, we need her to see that she just runs across and she's in the jungle. So I think we probably get rid of this whole cliff and just have the forest edge kind of along here, so that it's just she has a clear crack at it. The design of the film is obviously important for 2 reasons, really. There's a practical one, in the sense that you have to build a lot of things for a movie, so therefore they have to be designed. But the most, fundamental importance is the artistic one, in that the design of the film very much identifies the flavour and the tone of the movie.
We set out firstly through conceptual illustration, doing a variety of designs, but very quickly got into 3-dimensional sculpting.
Pete would give us suggestions on things he'd like to see, and we could have free rein over how we interpreted it. I spent just about all my time doing Kong A lot of the other designers were trying to establish the looks of the different dinosaurs.
The sculptors, they'd spent, I think, about 9 months sculpting some of those things. And some of these maquettes were, they're probably a good 4.5 feet long.
And the guys are prolific. We may end up doing 200 or 300 of these for a single film.
With all the maquettes and sketches and things, there must be over 700 different designs.
Alan Lee had stayed on after Lord of the Rings to add his inspiration into it. And with Gus and Jeremy, a huge amount of artwork was being produced every week.
The role really is to try and get inside Peter's mind and tease out the pictures that he's already forming.
We went at it one scene at a time, and he was very good at letting us know if there was a specific idea or look that he wanted to capture in that scene.
We would go away, we'd have a turnover of about maybe 3 or 4 days, and we'd try to get as many designs in front of him for him to have a look at it.
And Pete had said specifically, OK, well, you're getting the same brief, but I'd appreciate it if you didn't look at each other's work. That way we'll get different takes on the same brief.
And of course, this is a very interactive process. They would give Peter an original version. He'd say, yes, but there's more haze in the distance. No, there's a waterfall there. So many of these paintings were done several times until finally everybody had the version, said, yes, that's what that shot looks like.
That artwork becomes the only common thing that you have to talk about. Every discussion that you're having with either the lighting department or the art department or the miniature department, everything is all based on artwork.
From the standpoint of a cinematographer who's trying to get a particular look, it's the ultimate treat. You can say, if I achieve this, Peter will be happy with it.
So what we actually determined is we actually needed a conceptual design room. We actually set up a large room covered with pinboards and chronologically, from the beginning of the story to the end of the story, began laying the artwork out.
The entire movie was just around the walls of the design room. You could start at this corner and walk through the whole movie.
And in front of these thousands of paintings, there were boards lining up with hundreds of paintings pinned onto those as well. I mean, we just absolutely had no room. We could have covered 2 of those rooms, I think.
And I think in total they produced over 5,000 paintings to conceptualise the look of Skull Island in New York.
Mad, in under 2 years. I think on Rings I did 640 paintings in 4 years. I thought that was a lot. It's nothing.
Once we started the art and we began to feel the visuals were on track, that's when we got our previs department started.
Pre-visualization, or we call it previs for short, is a technique whereby we start to work out action scenes in 3 dimensions inside a computer.
Typically what we used to do is we used to storyboard this, shot by shot. I'd sit down with Peter and we'd draw each shot.
The interesting thing about previs on Kong, compared to Lord of the Rings particularly, was that there were no storyboards. And when we started off, there was no script. It was pretty much floating free.
The first one we did, for example, was the ending sequence, because Peter knew right off the bat that needed to be in the film. And even before they had finished the script, you knew kind of what the story was.
Then we started doing the 3-way T-Rex fight. And that was before we actually had a script too.
Peter was very busy with Return of the King, so he kind of sat us down and said, look, I'm going to go away for a month. Why don't you guys just come up with some ideas and just free reign, whatever you guys can come up with in a month. I'll come back and look at it and we'll just see where we're at. So you guys just go and have an experiment. And we were just like, oh my God, this is going to be great.
It was just a case of exploring all the possibilities and making it as dynamic and as exciting as we possibly could.
It's been really, really exciting to come up with all this stuff. I mean, whether or not any of it gets used is irrelevant, really. It's just sort of putting it in a creative pot and see what happens.
The way that previs worked was that we would go into a sort of 3D scene, we'd develop a choreography of the scene, and then show that to Peter from a big, wide, high view.
Once that was worked out, just what the action was, then the previs guys would go in with different cameras and cover it.
Like a shoot crew does on an action scene where you just stick cameras everywhere and just see what you get, as well as trying to also have choreographed cameras that are working out specific parts of the story.
We're just sort of supplying him with camera coverage, and then, once he's got that, he'll start editing it together. And it's his way of, directing the scene and editing it before he even has to go shoot anything.
previews on Kong was kind of unique in that the people who were doing the previews were the animation supervisors and the animation leads who then took the shots in the previews through to final animation.
I think it's got to be probably one of the most important things, because the previs was going to become the blueprint for the shot, and you need to have strong animation because you need all those weight and physics and performance to be there from the get-go.
But when we had to animate human beings, it was actually much quicker for us to capture the performances on the motion capture stage than it was for animators to actually animate them.
Feel like some kind of circus strongman.
I ended up, dressing up in the motion capture suits and spending quite a few days on the mocap stage with Christian and with Eric.
I'm actually wearing Andy Serkis's old Gollum motion capture suit, which I don't think has been washed since Andy was in it last. It certainly doesn't smell that way anyway.
You look like a real twit wearing these suits.
Here we go.
It was a chance for Pete to really, get his head around the physical logistics of those scenes as well.
You'll just come and
Pete always wanted to play Denham, though.
Pete's playing Denham, and he's been attacked by all these giant wetters that are jumping at him, so we get to throw pillows at him.
And he was going absolutely bonkers. That was great. It was a really fun day to be down there.
God, I got so exhausted I was nearly throwing up.
God, I hope that Jake Black can do it, because it's certainly killing me.
It was kind of fun because we worked up a lot of the gags on the previs stage. We actually had so much of the film previs that I was able to have a little screening in our cinema and actually have a premiere of the King Kong previs footage.
Pete showed everybody basically 5 animatics, and the last sequence was of the Empire State Building.
And it's so weird, you see like this computer stuff, like, everything, and you start feeling the emotion already there.
I swear to God, I teared up. That sounds so pitiful, but I did. And there were people around me who got emotional.
People were genuinely moved by 10 minutes of previs and were just kind of shaking afterwards. And I thought, this is going to be a hard act to follow. I don't know how the hell you make this better.
At the end of the sequence, when the lights came up, there wasn't a dry eye in the house. Now, if you can create that kind of emotion in something that's just rough animation, well, you've really done a great piece of directing.
I cried at the animatics. I'm in trouble.
It's emotional, but it's well constructed, so it's like it all makes sense.
That animatic was so amazing to watch, and you just got it. You just understood it.
The animatics are a great way of communicating what your ideas are to the cast and to the crew. Everyone knows what film they're making, and they know what the film's gonna look like.
For the most part, the Empire State Building sequence, as it stands in the film, is almost exactly like the previs. And I remember Pete saying this when we finished editing it. He sort of chuckled and he sort of said, the funny thing is we're not going to have time to change this. That this is probably what the sequence is going to be like in the film.
Previs, in a sense, started off as a replacement for storyboarding, but we took it one step further in that it became the basis for how we built the film.
Because we were using fully 3D computer graphics, in previs we're actually getting to design a lot of the geographical components to the shots. All that 3D geometry that we were playing around with then became like the blueprint for what Grant Major would have to build on a set and what the miniatures departments would have to build.
And we had what we called the red carpet, which was, you know, a line of action down the previs where things absolutely had to match because something was going to happen there.
So all that was important to us was that where the characters were actually interacting with the environment stayed true through to the miniature build. But then beyond that, you know, they can art direct it themselves.
We can't have to make it absolutely perfect, because if it's not, when they put the Brontos back into our miniature, the Bronto feet won't touch the ground when they run.
So what we did was actually utilise the previs department's information to drive the computer-controlled cutter and cut all of our profiles out of the polystyrene sheet, and then utilise those as the framework for our miniatures. And in turn, we can now deliver miniatures that correlate back to the previs at a much greater degree.
Miniatures on Kong were hugely important because they became our world. We did very little location shooting for Kong.
Peter wanted to create this from the ground up. He wanted every shot to have been completely designed to create the mood that he was looking for in that particular sequence. And the only way to do that is to build it.
So Kong used way more miniatures than any of the Lord of the Rings films. I mean, I think it probably used as many miniatures as all 3 Lord of the Rings films combined.
And it was a combination of taking the previs geo and the Photoshop paintings and matching them together.
That artwork would then go down with the undressed mini to miniatures to Alex Funky. Those guys would dress it, looking at the artwork, and they did an amazing job at matching.
And they were able to start shooting the miniatures before we ever started shooting live-action photography.
So we're getting ready to shoot what is the actual first production film rolled on King Kong. This is in the middle of a gigantic scene where Kong fights the Tyrannosaurus Rex. Cameras ready? Let's do it.
In the original film, the proof of concept was that fight. And so sort of an homage to that, Peter said, we're going to do this same sequence first.
Shooting in a studio, you're starting with a blank slate. So the art department have to build a huge number of relatively complicated sets.
There was a non-stop building program on King Kong. We had to build everything, you know, so trees, bark, vines, plants, flowers, even the water that went into the swamps and all that sort of stuff was manufactured because everything had a textural value that you can't just go out and buy.
We realised that looking at what the needs of Kong were, we didn't really have a studio that was big enough. So we started building one at our Stone Street studios very soon after Return of the King finished.
So this is the Kong stage, this is the new stage we're building. It'll be our biggest sound stage, so very important to us. We're going to build all the big Kong jungle sets in here.
We hope to have it finished by the end of August. We're going to start double shifts from Monday onward.
The Kong stage was almost finished by the time the actors arrived, but not quite.
I suppose I only had like 1.5 wall on at the time. And I said to Peter, is this for your next movie? And he said, no, this is for Kong. I just couldn't believe it, you know. And you're not kidding me, right?
And I think they were amused to see, to walk onto the lot and see a studio that was still basically being constructed while they were arriving to shoot the movie. But the stage got finished and it performed incredibly well for the film.
Whoa, my goodness.
There's something about the actor's arrival that makes it all feel very real. Everything goes into high gear at that stage.
That time was spent basically going through various costume and makeup tests. But one of the other things that everyone was doing respectively was their sort of schoolwork in regards to what their characters did.
Naomi, I think, had the toughest job because Naomi had to dance quite a lot and she had to learn very quickly.
They came up with the idea that you're going to do a dance with Jamie Bell. And I was like, oh, God, no, please.
The thing is, and I'm not blowing my own trumpet at all because I would never do that, but I'm a pretty seasoned dancer. I danced since I was 6 years old, so I've been dancing half my life already.
I kept thinking, oh no, I'm holding him back because we would do a few rehearsal numbers and he, of course, got it in 2 minutes. And it would take me 20 times to get, 3 steps.
think she's a little bit nervous. A little bit.
Sorry, my fault.
No, that's my fault. I just kicked her.
No, you didn't. Your mic shouldn't have been there.
Ah, that's true. I didn't want to say that.
I remember always sending her like little messages at night saying, "You were awesome today. Don't worry, it's all gonna be fine. I'm gonna make you look like Billy Elliot." You know, all these kind of messages to kind of make her feel good and stuff. But she did so well.
I taught him a few moves. He can dance, that kid.
We had camera instructions because our camera crew in our movie were shooting with an old hand crank Bell and Howell camera.
And it's the original camera that William Fox purchased to start 20th Century Fox. And we had to learn how to handle it.
So Alex Funky kindly offered to do a bit of a training session on that.
So there's a couple of things. One of them has to do with how fast you turn the crank. If you're going to be operating, you should be the man. So it's 3 turns a second.
It's all manual, you know. You've got to be turning the thing at a kind of precise motion, because if you go too fast, then the image goes in slow motion. If you go too slow, it looks like Babe Ruth running around the bases at the speed of light. It was a common mistake back then.
It's exhausting to do it well. He also showed us the little things that come in handy of just setting it down on the tripod or picking it up with the tripod and how to carry it.
Easy part cheesy.
Hot points.
How about when you're running away from f***ing dinosaurs? Oh man, that's gonna be a bitch.
One of my favorite memories is just practicing running from dinosaurs. And all of us really hoping that they'd come up with a good fake camera for us to use, because it is heavy.
Okay. Not heavy at all.
Jack, of course, the first thing he said was, well, we can just talk about this. Let's go shoot something. So we hold the camera out and we started shooting some film, and it was great.
Action! We did one called The Boxer. It was just me and Colin Hanks boxing each other in 1930s boxing style. And another one we did was some criminal on the run from the coppers. But they were pretty funny. I thought we did some good short films.
Cut! Well done. Excellent.
We had to train with boats because we were on a ship and we had to make the crew of the ship feel like they were a real ship's crew.
Captain Jennifer, lovely Captain Jennifer, who we love, taught us about how life goes, daily life goes on a ship and stuff.
Yeah, the whole ship's run on hierarchy, and the captain is God, basically. What he says goes.
And she told us how to tie the knots and stuff like that.
Then it got to the time where she was like, okay, now you've learned pretty much the basics and all, all that kind of thing. Why don't we just get out on the water and do some stuff?
When it came time for the cast to have a bit of boating experience, my boat was available. So we had 2 or 3 days of familiarity training.
Can I press the air horn?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Might as well.
All right! What's up? Who's going to be the first one to get sick today?
We're not getting sick, we're pros.
At the moment, we're practicing balancing, and it's, to get our sea legs. It's quite easy. But
one of the cast members got a little sick. I'm not going to say who.
The night before, I forgot that we had to go out on a boat, and yeah, it was a late night.
You all right, Becky?
Holy cow! Our first casualty. Our first sea casualty. That is hilarious.
I actually had to retire downstairs to the lower decks and take a bunk and just try and ride it out. It was a little embarrassing,
And I was kind of laughing about it. I said, oh, man, he's sick, huh? You feeling all right, dude? And then it was funny because I started to feel sick, but I didn't tell anybody. because, you know, you didn't want to live that down. Oh, man, remember that day Evan was seasick?
We went out on the boat a couple of times, and the second time we went out on the boat, it looked quite, it was quite stormy.
This is just a lovely tropical day here in Wellington.
Oh, yeah.
He took us out a little bit into, like, the rough waters to feel the waves crashing up over the boat.
Here we go.
Oh, fuck, man. No way! Oh, fuck! Oh, yeah, baby! Yeah! Hey! Oh, my God! That's huge, man! Is that safe?
And we took turns to take the helm, and at one point I said, I got to look at the horizon, and Evan knew exactly what that implied, and he just pushed everyone out of the way in case I hurled.
Yeah, there was a little bit of vom here and there, but no, pretty much everyone made it okay. We had a couple of stormy days during that period.
And we had to turn back prematurely because I was feeling so sick.
Lobo's not feeling too good. Yeah. I don't want to. And Richard's taking pity on him.
And imagine, you know, being at sea like that for days and weeks on end in that kind of condition. Oh, I'd probably die.
We've just been sailing, and now we're going to be doing a little bit of cookery, bit of Lumpy, chopping up, learning to be the cook, the excellent cook that he is. I went and did some cookery lessons with Martin Bosley, one of New Zealand's most famous chefs. Learned how to chop efficiently.
And it's that rocking motion, like, this is the extension of the body. So, so don't bring your knife back so far. Keeping those fingers tucked back out of the way of the blade. Yeah, well, you're going to cut yourself, right?
See, I didn't even notice that. God, that's pathetic, isn't it?
He's obviously getting better, though.
It's just brilliant, isn't it? In the scenes, he cooks sheep's brains with walnut sauce. So I actually got to chop up some sheep's brains. I'm vegetarian.
These are poached first, which is going to infuse a bit more flavour into his brains.
So none of these lamb's brains were ever hurt in the making of this film, okay? Bled all over the sheep's brains.
We had period firearms, Tommy gun instructions.
The guns, we love the guns.
Okay, fire it, whoa! King Kong! Shoot him in the head! I want to close my eyes when I shoot. That's not good, though, is it?
It's not good.
I'm afraid that like a piece of shrapnel might go in my eyeball.
I think we ordered 30,000 blanks at one stage so we could let rip with those machine guns.
I'm no longer a Tommy gun virgin, and quite frankly, it's one of the most enjoyable experiences of my life. I don't think there's anything that can top it.
Luckily, I'm going to be shooting mostly film in this movie.
Holy shmoly, only 1 week to go. 1 week today we start shooting. Quite a busy day. We're going to do a script read-through this morning with the cast, which is going to be fun. Once you gather your cast together, you sit around a table and you read the script out loud, just like reading a school play.
Scream, man! Scream as if you like to...
Damn, that was great.
We were able to feel the scenes either coming alive or not, and we were able to make suggestions and cuts and changes.
The read-through was kind of when everyone was kind of like, oh, wow, the script is going to change quite a bit.
I thought it was already really kick-ass, but they were like, oh, God, no. This is just a sketch of what it is.
The read-through, gave us ideas to change things, except we were only right on the verge of shooting some of these scenes. Wednesday, 5 days to go, and my head's spinning a little bit because we're doing major script revisions at the moment. I had a long talk with Philip and Fran last night, late at night, and we're doing some major alterations which are actually going to significantly impact on the first few weeks of shooting. So things are a little bit crazy. And so I just thought the best thing to do was just to be up front, get everybody together and explain to them what we were doing and why. So, we had a very important little summit meeting on the set of the Venture.
It was right before we started shooting, I think, and it was very confusing because we were ready to go, and Peter says, so welcome to our world, we're going to change everything.
What I'm expecting if I go to see King Kong, and what we're not delivering, is a sense of a mysterious adventure. Our movie becomes a mysterious adventure when we arrive on the island. The island onwards is kind of fine, and the issues are not really with that. It's everything up to the island. Our original screenplay was very much based on the idea that Denham knew that there was an island called Skull Island. He knew about a creature on the island, and we were sort of teasing with the idea that this is where they're going, and to actually be aiming to find a very tiny remote island and then actually ending up there is essentially undramatic.
There was no tension in the front of the film. Drove me crazy there was no tension in the front of the film. And then finally we went there and said, we've got to fix this. And we put some tension in the front of this film, which is the map.
Just the fact that nobody knew where we were going, except for me and Englehorn, there's just going to be a lot more intrigue to the whole journey. It was a subtle difference, but it really had a ripple effect where they had to rewrite a lot of things.
Literally, the script changed. Like, everything changed. Like, so many script revisions came out within 2 weeks. It was insane.
Every time they do a rewrite, it's like, wow, that's a great idea. God, I am under the gun. I could have memorized this thing. So there's been a lot of, like, last-minute scrambling. That's good stuff.
Yeah, that's good stuff.
Now, let's start with the docks being built out here in Container City. That's all very exciting. The art department's going to make a marvellous at some stage or other. That's where we'll start shooting, we hope.
The first AD is very involved in pre-production because what the first assistant director is doing is figuring out strategically the best order to shoot the film in. And it's a real art.
Well, I just asked Peter because we always just do what Peter wants to do, but that's not entirely true. So what I always like to do is I always like to start scheduling a film in script order.
And as it was, the first thing we were going to shoot was the New York docks. So those last few weeks of pre-production were very hectic with the Venture, the ship being built in our parking lot, docks being constructed.
No more days till we start shooting. None. In fact, only a few minutes till we start shooting.
That was the beginning of the production diaries too, that very first night.
Hello, welcome to Kong is King, the internet fan site for the movie we're making, the remake of King Kong, and I'm here on the set the first night of shooting. This is a night shoot, we're just waiting for it to get dark, and it's exciting.
Ready now and action!
Is this the moving picture ship?
I remember being reasonably well prepared on that first night and feeling okay. We did a lot of takes of the first shot.
Is this the moving picture ship? Is this the moving picture ship? Is this the moving picture ship?
And cut! No, didn't get it then. Okay, one more.
I made a mistake of shooting it with a crane instead of a Steadicam, and so I was kicking myself quietly as that first shot was being done, and we were doing, 15, 16, 17 takes.
And cut!
Cut it!
Pretty good. Let's have a look at that one.
Finally, when it was a take, though, and they got it, I looked over, and there was Peter, and he had a grin on his face. And I said, how does it feel? He goes, what's that? I said, how does it feel, that 13-year-old getting the first shot done and in the can? You could see a 13-year-old kid. That little kid was like, yeah, I did. That was a pretty neat thing to see.
But anyway, we got through the first shot and got that night under our belts.
Thank you. Just grab this.
End of the first day.
There's a huge relief when you have that first set and they roll for the first time. That's, whoa, we're halfway there. We weren't halfway there.
Okay, guys, and action!
We have a number of different ventures. I think in filming the movie, we used like 4 or 5 different ventures. The main one and the most spectacular one was a real ship.
Peter and Dan were very keen to source a ship, and it's quite hard, I would think, to track down a ship of that period. Dan is an old sea dog, and he's the best man to send out on a mission like this.
Back in the 70s, When I was training as an architectural draftsman, I got a little bit bored and I decided to try and get a little adventure into my life. And I got a job on a trawler. It felt great and I loved it, and I did it for 8 years, which was never my plan. My plan was really to do it for 6 months and get back on the drawing board. But that gave me a background and a knowledge of boats and ships and how they operate. And I think that was the reason that sort of Pete decided I'd probably be the right person to look for a boat.
Going right back to the very early times, Dan, Hannah and Peter had acquired a ship when I first came on, a ship called the Manuia.
I got a call from a guy called Steve McIntyre, who's into boats in a big way, in shipping, and he said, look, I've just flown over the Tauranga Harbour and I think I've seen the boat you're looking for. It's tied up down here.
And there she is, very dodgy old gangway there.
So I managed to get hold of the owner of the ship and said, would you like to sell it? And he said, yeah, he was sort of prepared to move on from this ship. But it had 40 tonne of tuna on board.
It's 2 50-foot containers. Wow. Actually, there's 40 tonne of tuna in here at the moment.
Is that right? Bloody hell.
And there was weird legal stuff associated with this frozen fish.
Because it wasn't a New Zealand registered boat, they couldn't unload their tuna.
I mean, we didn't want frozen fish, and we didn't want to, give them to the catering department on the film to feed us with either. We just wanted to get rid of them.
We got this guy to negotiate with the government who said, OK, if you sell the ship in New Zealand, we'll let you offload the fish into containers and ship it out of New Zealand.
It was a bit weird. A bit of a strange thing, the frozen fish. Slightly shady, dodgy, unusual.
So we did our deal. He got to unload his 40 tonne of tuna. We got to get the boat and bring it down to Wellington and start to modify it and turn it into the venture.
We wanted the ship to be like an old tramp steamer, probably built around the turn of the century. And by the time the 1930s come about, it's on its last legs. It probably should have gone to the scrap metal yard a few years earlier.
We had a look at the original movie for clues as to the venture design, but the Manuia is a smaller boat than what was in the original King Kong film. So I did a series of drawings based on the hull shape of the Manuia. In every instance, the hull design of the Manuia kept tripping us up in a way, because the 1950s hull design is quite different from turn of the century. Back then, the bow of the boat was pretty much vertical. So one of the first things we decided to do was to weld on a new front.
So they're welding on some plates and some other steel, and then tomorrow morning we'll be bringing in this big piece of steel L shape that will be swung under the water up through the scaff and be attached to what these guys are doing right now.
And so the next step in the process, once these are all braced back to the ship, is that we'll clad it with steel plate, put up rivets on, and it'll look like a 1910 ship rather than a 1950s ship.
We also had to build quite a bit of superstructure amidships to make it obvious that you could carry up to 30 people.
So from here, where the wheelhouse ends, to that post on the bulwarks down there, we're going to be creating a whole new superstructure for the ship. It's going to have 3 levels. It's going to be cabins, then the captain's cabin, and then the bridge on top of that.
We also had to change the structure of where the funnel was, so we had to create a funnel with steam and smoke that could come out of.
One of the biggest jobs I had on here was to redesign an exhaust system, to reroute it through the engine room, through the hold, and up through this big red funnel. And to make it even more interesting, we've put a smoke maker in.
Being as a steam ship in the movie, but we're running a diesel ship, so we're having to create the smoke here.
Because of the era of the ship, they would have burnt coal, which would have made lots of black, dirty smoke.
Combined with this, the Manuia itself was an old boat, and it needed a lot of work to get it certified to be able to actually take it out of Wellington Harbour. It needed to have all the bottom of the boat cleaned, it needed to have its engine revamped, it needed to have all its ballast tanks tested and re-welded and God knows what.
I don't think they've cleaned it in about 20 years, so it's just rust, crap, and mud, and not very fun.
Those were really the major things. Other than that, it was a paint job and a couple of lifeboats.
And we used that real venture to do all the shots of the ship at sea.
Boarding the boat.
Art department have spent the best part of a couple of days dressing the boat. We've spent the last 9 months making the boat fit for this occasion. And tonight, she pulls away from the wharf for the first time on camera. She's pulling away.
Pete hates the sea, I think.
Peter doesn't like to go on the boat, on the water, right? He gets seasick, so...
I couldn't imagine anything more horrific than shooting on a real boat pitching in the ocean. So I was determined that as much as I possibly could, I'd shoot on dry land.
Pete was very keen to shoot the on-deck stuff in a controlled situation. So we built from the deck up on the back lot.
We're in the back lot, blue screen all around us, and this is the venture. Currently really just finishing off painting, and we'll start dressing it very soon.
Full astern. Full astern.
We built one version of the entire venture ship floating on the Manuia. We built the whole thing again on the back lot, an exact replica of it.
And elements that could be lifted off and bolted onto the real boat, and then you'd have all that sort of bridge, wheelhouse and cabin superstructure in both places for the cost of one.
It's also built on a big tilting rig, so everything was built on this massive steel frame, which we were able to crane into a tilted position. That was quite an interesting process.
Then you go shooting, and the boat is in the parking lot, you know, and you go like, how the f are we supposed to, like, fake that?
You know, yeah, it's all on the back lot on the imaginary ocean. You get the imaginary sea legs, you know, minus the seasickness.
It looks pretty amazing being tilted, actually, and it's interesting to walk on it. It's a slightly disconcerting effect, and we're starting to shoot the scenes that we need to have the boat tilted for, which is from the point that they run aground on the rock.
Of course, when the ship hits the rocks, there's a lot of water gets splashed about, and they had the big wet set happen outside on the back lot. That was quite interesting.
For the storm sequence, we built enormous dump tanks that dropped thousands and thousands of gallons of water down on the actors.
We've done a few tests. We're reasonably confident that we're not going to hurt anybody.
I like pain. I'd like to get really wet.
Did Andy get swept overboard? Maybe he did. You heard he did? I heard somebody did get swept overboard. Was it Andy?
It was Andy. It was Andy for sure.
Andy, boy.
My theory was that that the next time that this big water tank was going to be dumped on me, I would lean into it.
Poor Andy didn't quite time his dump tank reaction and then the box throwing moment. And what happened is he basically went to throw the box right as the dump tank was coming at him. And the dump tank literally washed him off his feet.
When the wave stopped and he threw the thing overboard, he had too much momentum, and he flipped over the end of the boat, and he held on and then let go and sort of landed in this net. But the net was really just there to catch, like, the stuff that was being thrown overboard.
We thought to catch mostly props because we didn't think that any of the cast would be mad enough to actually go over the side with their prop while they were throwing it.
But no one kind of realizes that Andy's fallen off the boat. So everyone's still throwing things down in the net.
And suddenly I realised that there was kind of lots of tea chests being kind of raining down, and luckily they're called cut. But that was quite early on. That was quite a moment.
Let's get everybody back to once, please. You're just reattaching the net a little tighter in case Andy decides to go off again.
Peter wanted to have a backstory to the venture, that it had been used by Englehorn and the owners to import animals to New York, including the New York Zoo and Central Park. So in the hold, it's just chock-a-block with cages.
Only a few very special people in the world will know what this is all about.
And it also smells of its past, use. So it's grotty. The ship is not the ideal sort of vehicle for bringing actors and film crews halfway across the world. I always saw it as being a sort of a mixed-use ship. There's passenger parts and there's cargo parts to it, but I think the cargo part of it has taken over.
It was all about the gags in the script. It's about the cabins are not really somewhere you want to be. You personally, given that room in a boat or a motel or a hotel, you'd go, whoa, have you got another room? This one smells.
So it's not exactly the sort of place I'd like to spend 6 weeks in.
When it came to designing Anne's room and all that sort of stuff, Anne's room had been used for storing animals in it as well. There's cages in the room, it smells when she first goes in there. The surfaces are sort of a bit grimy and dirty.
This beautiful glass has come from Melissa Spicer, one of the props buyers. Her parents' bedroom mirror has been dismantled and built into the store specifically for this.
Just to get down the passageway from the front of the ship to the back, you have to sort of squash past these stacked cages and all that sort of thing.
Bruce's cabin, it was all about the big star who gets given the second best cabin, but the second best cabin is actually only just enough room to turn round and certainly not enough room for the luggage.
Sure, make fun of the B-movie star. Oh, yeah.
Peter developed the Bruce Baxter role kind of as we were designing the film. At a kind of a late stage, he decided to have Bruce Baxter moving into his cabin, which we hadn't built. I had built a shoot-off just so that we can have one of the doors ajar in the Venture interior. So we ended up finishing off that as his cabin. And he wanted to have him unfolding his own movie posters with his own image on it.
Bruce Baxter is rather vain, and he's put his posters up of himself up in his room. And he has stepped outside and come back and seen that young Jimmy from the ship has graffitied on them. Peter's added his touch to them, as you can see.
Defacing Bruce Baxter posters, that's what I like doing. If Bruce Baxter was real, and these were authentic 1933 posters, these would be really worth about 10 grand each by now. So it's a good job that he's not real and these aren't real posters and they're not worth 10 grand.
Pete loves the old, I think he collects the old movie posters from the 20s, 30s, 40s, and they do have a particular look or finish to them.
If you got some pastels and you blended in around there, I reckon you'd be whistling Dixie.
Peter wanted to start off very, very, very close, where we could see the printing technique, in fact.
Grant was really pedantic about getting the look right, and I did so many iterations.
We invented some names for the movies, which we had to get vetted by the legal department.
Dame Tamer, Forbidden Love, Wrecked an Empire, Rough Trader.
Given our access to Peter, which was fairly short and sharp for everything, this poster was a real wild card. It literally got okayed by Peter the day that we were shooting it.
Peter, he actually had a few of those sent to me as gifts. They're framed. And my wife put the which one is it called? The tribal bride, or which one is it? It's in our bedroom. Slap it every time I climb into bed.
If you're at sea in a real vessel, you can only film what exists in front of your camera, so Weta Workshop made a large miniature.
The issue with the Venture was basically that it had to be in extreme danger, something that you could never practically do with a full-size ship. So we had to have a ship at a scale that was photographable, very close up, 12th scale in this case. In many cases, we were at the absolute limits of what we could do as far as focus, getting the camera right in next to the ship. It was amazing. The model guys were able to build such detailed, amazingly convincing museum-quality model.
The coolest miniatures to build are the rusty ones, because all that texture, all that wonderful colour and rusty metals and blistering paintwork is a really great scaling opportunity.
There's a life ring, so if anyone goes overboard, at least they will be safe.
We set about building that miniature, firstly photographing the original very, very accurately.
We pretty much didn't have any architectural drawings of this, so what we've done is gone down to set, taken a whole lot of photos and actually measured everything on there and actually stuck it on the photo. As you can see, looking at kind of that angle, that's the set boat and this is the miniature.
Then also working alongside Dan and Grant to figure out exactly what their thoughts were in the original full-size ship.
It was just a matter of being intelligent about it, because we had not a huge amount of people to work on that model. So, all our rivet heads, we actually managed to put them on a self-adhesive backing so you could lay down a whole strip of rivet heads at once.
Over here we have the little searchlight that fits on top of the bridge, fully operational. It tilts and pans and does all the things you'd expect a searchlight to do. It's just that we haven't been able to find anyone small enough to operate it.
A big part of that model was the lighting, and it was very important that the lighting could do what it needed to do on set.
We initially set up the Venture to have every single window with a light behind it. It's about 115 lights, I think, if I recall off the top of my head.
Internally, that means cutting the light from the window next door to it. So you actually build a little box inside each window, and all the multi-cores go back up into the central control room.
So we created a switchboard and wired that into dimmers so that every light can switch individually and dim individually, and it can all be operated by the cameras.
We were quite concerned that these lights would be very hot. So we got a jewellery company to actually cast the bulkhead lamps in white metal, and we had a glass blower up at the Victoria University actually blow little glass lenses so that they wouldn't actually melt.
There is a little hook designed to hold the door open when the door to the wheelhouse is open. Even though that door isn't even openable, but it's got this completely finished detail on there. It's that kind of thing that makes a good miniature work.
We got right down to detailing the insides of the cabins with woodworm in the woodwork.
The model makers here have even hung the coats on the hooks, and various bits of equipment inside are illuminated.
Pretty.
Virtually to the cup of coffee left on the windowsill inside the cabin.
The great test was, of course, showing Peter the approval photographs. One meeting where we presented them, he appeared slightly annoyed that he was being asked to yet again approve the paint finish on the full-size ship.
The miniature Venture is so realistic, I can see photos of it and I can't tell the difference. I mean, when they showed me the photograph of the miniature Venture for the first time, I looked at the photos and I thought they were just giving me photos of the full-size one because it was so detailed. It looked exactly like the ship that I recognised from the filming that we'd done on it.
Cut. Great. Let's move on to Anne's close-up.
So we were very pleased that he had mistaken it for the full-size ship, but in the photographs it's indeed impossible to tell it as not being a full-size piece of construction.
The miniature was a dead-on match to the real Venture. It looked amazing, but we knew we wanted to arrive in Skull Island in rough seas and in stormy weather, and there's no way you can plan for that kind of shoot. Peter felt it would just be easier if we could just create it ourselves, and that way we can control it and make it look the way that we wanted.
The advantage with having a ship that's surrounded by blue screen is that we were able to put any type of ocean that we wanted to, whether we wanted a calm ocean or a pitching, stormy ocean. So the one thing you can never control in film is the weather, except we were able to control the weather.
We built a digital Venture thinking that it may be used as a Hero digital asset, and a couple of times it was. We did some Hero set extension work, but by and large we didn't end up using the digital Venture as we'd initially expected to. Where it really came in useful was in terms of bridging the gap between the miniature Venture and creating digital water around that boat.
And this virtual Venture then had to be fitted over the miniature Venture. This is just a way of being able to work forward on two directions at the same time, shooting the miniature and already working on the digital water, which is very time-consuming to do.
Now, water is an extremely difficult thing to create because it's both a volume and a surface. So what that means is water can break apart and come back together again in a number of different ways.
There was actually quite striking pre-visualization done for the sequence where the Venture first approaches Skull Island in the fog. So looking at that, it made us realize that to get these sort of motions and this interaction of the boat and water, we'd have to come up with a computer graphics solution to the water.
That water goes through a whole bunch of stages. It starts off with what we call wave scouting or wave sculpting. Wave scouting refers to taking the water simulation tools that we have. The simulation tools that we have produce sort of an endless stretch of ocean, and as you start to crank the wind speed up, you get these really giant choppy waves out in the middle of the ocean, and so you literally hunt around through a kilometer by a kilometer's worth of digital ocean to find the shape that you're after. In some cases where we really needed something specific, like a rogue wave that happens to lift the Venture up in exactly this curved shape and smashes it around a rock that we were calling the pivot rock because the Venture slides against it. Those things were sculpted by hand. It should be noted that all of this simulation is happening in a two-dimensional sense. We have a plane of water that goes out kind of forever in every direction, and all we're doing is giving it a height. We're just lifting it up like a carpet. So once we have that carpet that's got the right shape, then the main things that we have to do from that point is start to add all of the various kinds of foam that really define the shot. We have a technique to analyze where the foam should occur. That tool that we built is called Crest Breaker, and it comes up with a representation of where the surface would be breaking into waves. The last step would be coming up with mist that just comes off the crests, like wispy little stuff that gets picked up by the wind, makes it feel really turbulent. Once we've done that in 3D, we take those rendered images and the compositors make them usable.
There are a couple of shots that it almost makes me shiver with fear to think that we actually did them, where they actually shot the actors in a rowboat that was on a little gimbal mount with shortened oars even, because they knew the oars were going to have to interact with the water. I wish they'd shot full oars in retrospect, but anyway, hindsight's a wonderful thing. One of the shots, they had Adrien Brody in a foreground boat, and then in the Avid, they'd taken a completely different element, which had Jack Black in a different rowboat, and put it behind the Adrien Brody one, and they just composited the two together and said, "Here, make this work." And we're like, oh my goodness. Ugh.
Those shots with the rowboats rowing towards camera are just deadly. I had sort of pessimistically declared that they would have to cut them because there's no way on earth we could possibly do it.
Just presents a big challenge because your water has to hold up nearby. You have to have the boat interactions and the splashes around the edge of the boat. You've got to have the oars going into the water and splashes from the oars. In addition, it's stormy and the waves are splashing against the boats.
And yeah, to the point of in some cases, some of the compositors in frustration took video cameras up to Breaker Bay or up to Island Bay, filmed stuff, digitized it, and put it in their shot instead of relying on trying to generate elements from scratch.
So you end up relying on your water tools and your water artists, and then on a talented team of compositors to take these elements and combine them all with these computer graphics elements to create a believable scene where they're approaching Skull Island. And you don't want the audience to be sitting back and saying, oh, well, what's that? That doesn't look quite right. You want them to be on the moment because these guys are going after Anne. They're trying to rescue Anne.
In our movie, I wanted Skull Island to be the most hellish, torturous jungle that you could ever possibly imagine, and I wanted something that was larger than life.
It's a very, very difficult place. It's not beautiful, it's aggressive, it's dangerous, it's sharp.
It's the kind of place that if you landed in the 30s on that island, you'd have maybe 2 or 3 hours up your sleeve, you know, and then it'd be over. The island would eat you alive.
So it started as a series of concept drawings to look at what the different locations on the island would look like, what the light would look like at different times of day.
Gus in particular started out doing some beautiful renditions of people crossing log bridges and this wonderfully mysterious jungle.
Pete was really good because he just let me go out on my own tangents, and it was a matter of me coming up with paintings of what would be spooky and eerie and what would look cool.
Almost from the day one, you know, the very first art that Gus was producing was just absolutely nailing Skull Island.
He captured the flavour of that island right then and there. You know, he probably got it in his second painting. So, you know, what he brought to that film was absolutely immense.
Key to the understanding of Skull Island is you have to realise that it's sinking, and as it sinks, it shrinks.
And now all we're left with is the very tip of this landmass that's jutting out as an island.
So I came up with the idea of the wall actually being the remaining part of one large encircling wall, which would have been at the very top of the island, enclosing this great city.
The area beyond the wall, which is where the dinosaurs and Kong live, was originally the inside of the wall of a huge city.
And what that allowed us to do is to go inside the gate and find this whole world that once existed.
And I know that Jeremy and Gus looked at different areas of Indonesia and Polynesia as inspiration.
There's this place, Nan Madol, up in Micronesia, and it has this unusual set of ruins that are made from basalt logs. And I had used a section of one of those ruins in one of my paintings, and it really caught Pete's eye. And that became the style for the construction of the wall and any architectural forms.
With artists like Jeremy and Gus, and obviously Alan Lee as well, you are constantly getting surprised because you're being shown things that are so much better than what I could ever imagine. And even just looking at the sketches, it was obvious that there's no way that we'd ever find a real jungle. Nothing in reality looks like this. This is so unique. And not going on location means one thing, basically, that everything has to be built.
And in the original film, that's exactly what they realised. If they wanted to capture this almost surreal world of Skull Island, it would have to be realised in a studio.
What's very memorable about the 1933 Skull Island is the way that they presented the jungle. It's very artificial and stylised, but, you know, it works beautifully well for the movie.
One of the jumping off points that Byron Crabb and the other art directors on Kong used was the great 19th century illustrations, engravings of Gustave Doré. They have a tendency to have a very bright or blown out background, and then a sort of more normally lit midground, and then a very dark sort of contrasty foreground. And this sort of depth was very characteristic of the 1933 version of King Kong.
I wanted us to capture much the same quality in our version. I wanted our version to sort of feel like our jungle was a close, you know, cousin of the 1933 jungle. So we used very much a layered approach.
You have those layers of foreground, middle ground, background, and normally as an art department we'd be involved in making all those things. We were much more involved in making the foreground.
To be efficient in live-action shooting, only a fairly small piece of dressed set was built on the live-action stage, and essentially behind that, just blue screen. And that's a perfectly good way to work because it means that you can focus on making that environment absolutely convincing.
The guys have been working around the clock in the last few weeks to get the set ready for our first day, and they have just got it done in the nick of time.
We are christening the Kong set. Now, if you want to take a quick look around, you'll see what that set is. And we had to do 6 months in the Southern Alps to train for this.
When they built the jungle, I mean, this jungle is absolutely amazing. It had rivers and this and that and everything. I mean, it was just beautiful.
It is a real sort of living, breathing forest hell pit. Yeah, I mean, there are real insects in there.
This is a New Zealand tarantula.
Pointed up and said it doesn't.
Hugely venomous. Usually you'll lose a limb within 30 seconds of a bite.
As cool as it was to get what we were seeing, that's amazing. And then you realize that so much more is going to be added with all the blue screens.
Peter had become very fond of the technique of extending a built set with a miniature set, and we'd used it with great success in the Rings films, and he wanted to use even more of that here.
I love the fact that with miniatures you can create a scale and a grandeur and a stylization that you are never going to get in the natural world.
So in many cases, he would arrange to have a set that was only built up to where it would clear the actors' heads, and everything above that would be either a digital extension or a miniature extension. And this was used very effectively in, let's say, the village wall, for example.
We built our 12th scale miniature first, and then it was surveyed, and the set was actually built from the miniature.
But it was only built about halfway up, and only a section about 200 feet long was constructed. Every time that you see any more than that, that's a miniature extension. So that's creating an enormous area of landscape that you could never hope to build and you could never hope to find.
The miniatures were shot sometimes in layers that would be sandwiched together to create this ever-receding depth.
So when we're looking at a master shot of the log chasm, you have the chasm that's near camera, and then where that ends, you have another piece of chasm that's a little further away and it's getting a little more out in the sunlight to create the sense that it goes from dark and gloomy up here in the foreground to bright and sunshiny way in the distance.
This is the log that spans the crevasse. We've built this at 10th scale, and now what the art department will do is replicate a big chunk of it and then build that huge piece of tree onto a massive 6-way gimbal mover that will throw the actors around on top of this chunk of tree. So it should be pretty exciting.
We don't get the fun. The fun's with the actors who actually get to ride the wooden stallion.
Basically what happens is you're harnessed to the tree, so you're stuck on the tree. Mine a little readjustment going on. Yeah, we're all good. I was at the end of the biggest limb of the tree, and the thing is, it threw me up with such force that my arse actually came off of the tree. And I think what it is Peter's like going, ramp it up 10%, ramp it up 15%. You know, as the more takes go on, because it was getting pretty violent. Oh, my balls!
It's fun. I like that stuff. It's making me want to do more action-y roles.
When you're dealing with sets with blue or green screens and all miniatures, you're obviously going to end up with large spaces that need to be filled.
And that's almost always done with matte paintings, because you can build layers of depth in that you really would have a hard time doing in the miniature.
Matte paintings are used primarily to avoid having to go out on location, and you can manipulate the matte painting almost infinitely. You can change the colors, you can change the time of day, you can change the clouds, and it gives a scene a big scope and takes it from an indoor studio look to an outdoor look.
And then ultimately we're to digital composite the pieces, dropping in the digital matte painting, the digital enhancement necessary to make the scenes of Skull Island as visually stunning as Peter originally imagined them in his head.
And hopefully our created Skull Island has some resemblance to the 1933 original Skull Island, because I like the idea that we have shot our movie on the same Skull Island locales as what the original film was shot on.
The original ideas for the Skull Islanders were much more theatrical maybe than what we thankfully settled on.
We thought at one stage maybe it was like the survivors of a Dutch trading ship, and they'd inbred on the island and become, you know, like deliverance people.
We clothed them in a combination of very primitive native costuming ideas crossed with the clothing that was taken off the ship all those centuries earlier, such as ruffs around the neck, puffed out skirts and such like. So some pretty kooky ideas, but you do have to go there in the process of filtering down to the definitive design concepts that you use in a film.
And, you know, we ended up trying to not be too fanciful. I mean, nothing is really made up in the way that they're portrayed. It wasn't based on any particular civilization, but it was a sort of a melting pot of different cultures and different ethnic groups around that area in the world, and we sort of did an amalgam.
Dominique and I did a bunch of makeup tests, which we had a ball doing. Pete said, well, just try to come up with as many different kind of looks as possible. And so, you know, we did everything from appliances that would go through the nose where they actually punctured the cartilage to keloid scarring, and the keloid scarring is where they actually scar themselves, but the scars actually get quite raised.
One of the most amazing things was one of the actors that came in for their face cast for us to do prosthetics on already had scarring on their face from their life back in their previous country. And to actually take a mould of a person that had heavy cutting into the forehead was really amazing and incredible to talk to this person.
The way that they dress suggests that they really make use of whatever materials they can find to decorate themselves. And there's not a lot of materials that are available for them.
Pete was the one who came up with the idea, I believe, of using that they use their own hair.
We've made a series of cloaks, and I've just finished doing this third cloak, and I've strung a series of imitation human teeth along the edges.
We also have the problem of hiding nudity. A very, very primitive race would not in any way care about it. But of course, because of the rating of the movie, we're trying to very carefully and subtly hide things under G-strings and so on.
I personally think it's a little bit too small. We need a bit more room.
We wanted the people on Skull Island to basically be quite thin, because we imagined that, you know, they would be emaciated to some degree. But when you're in Wellington, New Zealand, it's hard to find that sort of person. So we had to get lots of different people from all over the world.
We had Sudanese, we had Māori, we had Polynesian, Fijian, Cambodia, just all sorts of different people.
I'd say that this group of extras logistically has probably been the hardest group to deal with in terms of communication. I mean, obviously we've got language barriers.
This is the first job I've had where we've had to work with a translator. His name's George.
And I'm here interpreting or translating for Sudanese in Arabic and most Sudanese languages.
You're not mimicking Kong. We're not going to do gorilla dances.
And then through training from the choreographers, this diverse cultural mix of people formed a single, united group. the makeup team that had to apply the prosthetics and hair and so on the days took to it with an amazing enthusiasm.
On our heaviest day, we had about 40-some makeup artists.
We're frantically trying to finish off the natives. We're now on our last hour. It's getting dark outside, so they want to do a block through. So hopefully very soon we'll be done.
Well, a year after we started on these guys, we're finally here on set. It's an amazing feeling.
We had them out in the freezing cold night with no clothes on, well, very little clothes on, and then we put rain on them. And it was wonderful how well they did.
And just keeping these people warm was an undertaking.
Hot chocolate? Thank you.
But I think the scenes now give a unique and defining look to the Skull Islanders of Peter Jackson's film.
One of the things about the original King Kong that I loved when I saw it when I was 9 was the dinosaurs. I mean, I think all kids love dinosaurs, and thankfully my fascination with dinosaurs hasn't diminished as I've grown up. I mean, I just think they're the most incredible creatures that you could possibly imagine, and I wanted our Kong dinosaurs to be big and mean and very scary.
One of the things that Pete said to us in the very first few days, I want it to be a horror show, and that gave us an amazing freedom in the design of the creatures.
And we want everything to look as real as possible, but at the same time, we're not necessarily doing everything the way that paleontology says it should be.
I figured this is not, dinosaurs as they were 65 million years ago. This is dinosaurs as they evolved to 1933 on Skull Island.
And so in all that time, they've changed, and there are different characteristics of the dinosaurs.
But more importantly, we wanted them to complement the creatures of the original film. So we set about designing the creatures on the island with that aesthetic in mind.
I wanted to do a throwback T-Rex to the sort of creature that we used to see in the old movies, like the original King Kong. A tyrannosaur with scales on his back and with crocodilian skin and things that the experts tell us, dinosaurs didn't actually have, but I still think they look a lot better. They look a lot cooler on film.
When we started on the original pass of Kong 9 years ago, Peter always imagined there to be an amazing battle between Kong and not just one T-Rex, but in fact 3 T-Rexes. I don't know whether back then we'd imagine them as being particularly different in age or build, but when we came to design the new Kong, we decided that we would try and invest into it a little bit more of a back history. So we ultimately designed the 3 T-Rexes as a family.
The matriarch is still the biggest, but she's getting a lot saggier, her tail droops more, she's really been through the war, she's got a lot of scarring and stuff.
Then the bull, he's quite staunch, and he's got a much stronger jaw. His teeth are a little bit more healthier.
He really is in his prime there. He's pretty ripped, and he looks like he's ready for a fight all the time.
And then we've got the juvenile. He's kind of like the puppy dog because he's actually still kind of growing into his body.
It gave the animators something to work with so that there's extra character that's being brought to bear by having these ideas as the basis for the work that they're doing.
Some creatures we completely made up. For example, we designed a whole new creature that we called a wetasaur.
And he started off as a bipedal type creature, but we suddenly found that we're stepping on toes of either the V-Rex or the Raptor. So Pete's decision was to get him down on all fours and come up with something with a totally different look and profile.
The back creature, that was a wonderful design process. I think we did more design maquettes for that particular creature's head than anything else on the island.
And you can see around us the amazing array of different designs that they've been trying, all within quite a tight brief.
We were going all out just to be disgusting with that guy. We were looking at things for reference, which you probably couldn't put it on these DVDs.
One of the great bits of mythology that any Kong fan knows about is the way that the insect pit was shot in the 1933 film. It's a sequence that was ultimately cut out of the film where the sailors are attacked by giant spiders and crabs and insects and devoured.
And, you know, there were various stories that it slowed down the action too much on the film, or other stories that it was too horrific and they decided to cut it.
Of course, if you're going to redo the movie, you want to take the opportunity to get everything in that you couldn't do the first time around. So we definitely wanted to get the insect pit sequence in there and have it, you know, be a major point of what happens in the film.
In Peter Jackson's version of King Kong, he had sort of put in a catch that meant he had to do this sequence, which is there's a plot point that Carl Denham's camera gets destroyed at the bottom.
It's the moment in time where the thought of capturing Kong alive, you know, enters his mind. It's really the only hope he's got of salvaging anything from this experience.
This amazing sequence that has been long lost from the original film, we could now recreate. And that was an amazing opportunity to visualize all array of demonic and crazy creatures.
The design on those things was somewhat based on real insects and things, but almost like getting little bits of insects and putting them all together into one kind of, you know, weird kind of creature. So we had this thing called a pit crab. You've also got the pit spiders.
And then there's the giant weta, you know, our namesake creature, which is the one creature that's not fantastical at all in the film, apart from the fact that it's the size of a dog.
For the insect pit, we wanted to get some actual real wetas to play with, so Gino from the workshop scored us some wetas from the Wellington Zoo. And it was sort of a question that we had is, I think it's a sort of thing a lot of people wonder is, do wetas bite?
Uh-oh, uh-oh, uh-oh.
He got me!
Boy, they can bite really hard! Are you getting... Oh, yeah, look at the blood.
And we found the answer. Yes, they do.
Hold on, be careful! Then, of course, we had the pit slug. What a weird, creepy creature that was.
It's disgusting. It's slimy. It's long and pink. Has hair sticking out of some parts of it.
You know, it's no hiding what it kind of resembles, and it's just disturbing.
Basically, it's a penis with teeth. It comes down to that. And Jamie Bez Work was a design master on that.
It worked out well. It was the first one I did, and I thought, oh, these sort of big sluggy, wormy type things and big sacks kind of just sliding out. It was just kind of like, ugh.
I was there when they were presenting maquettes and drawings to Pete, just thinking that's just so bad. You know, there goes the rating. He'll just walk straight past that. But no, straight to it. Yeah, that's what I want. Knowing full well that it was as phallic as you could possibly get.
The pit slugs were really interesting because they had to rise up out of the swamp and they've got to stir up the mud and they've got to interact with the mud. So we worked out some CG techniques, but I really felt we'd need to shoot some elements for that as well.
And basically they built this big kind of tub and they filled it with this mud. And to get the interaction, the special effects guys were given this very phallic kind of shape, and they had to get in there and move this thing around so it would interact with the mud.
It was just ridiculous. Sitting there, it was the most tense day of my life shooting that stuff, because it's like, boy, is this going to work?
Push it down. Push the slug down more.
We had to get the shot where the thing is submerged under the mud and it slowly starts to rise up. But the problem that they had was this thing was made out of foam and it wouldn't sink.
This should not be in any DVD, any video, should not even be recorded.
Yeah. But it was hysterical because they're trying to submerge this giant penis thing and trying to, classic stuff. And it just, nobody could keep a straight face.
Oh, yeah, okay, cool. Sorry, people.
But the images that they got were fantastic because when you see these pit slugs actually come out of the mud, you see all this stuff dripping off of there. And that's the stuff that we shot on that day.
The very first time I saw the pit slug and Lumpy's demise was at the New York premiere.
When he shot the scene, he had no idea what these things looked like, you know, so it was kind of nice keeping him in the dark about that stuff and just wait till the final day.
When the pit slug eventually rose to its fullest height and came over the top of Lumpy's head, I started to howl and I was pissing myself laughing.
And I just remember hearing Andy just cracking up, just going, oh my God. Oh my God. And the whole audience is just going, oh, gross. And it was just like, you know, yes, we did it.
I had tears literally pouring down my face. It was unbelievable. I had no idea it was going to be that disgusting. And my son, Sonny, came up afterwards And he just went, Dad, what does it look like on the inside of that thing's mouth?
In coming back to Skull Island again for Kong 05, we were in some cases able to use designs that had already been started or were near finished in 1996.
Jamie Bess-Warwick designed a Raptor, and Peter loved this design.
What I tried to do with that was get a few more sort of slightly mammalish features in there. So the face was a little bit more doggish. I was sort of trying to make something that looked a bit sort of pit bull-like.
And so when we came to, finally do our version of Kong, I said, let's just stick with the old design because that was really cool.
The brontosaur came from the original take. We had the foam model, which was going to be a stop-motion puppet. At the first meeting with Pete, he picked up that Bronto and said, well, we'll use this.
Which is interesting because they got a lot more experience and skilled in building these dinosaurs, really, as they went along. And so the Bronto model was a little coarser, I guess you'd say, than the later T-Rex models that we built.
And so we ended up having to go back in there and sculpt in digitally a lot more of the detail back into it. It was one of those things where, hindsight, it would have been better for us to actually go back and resculpt it again. It was probably one of the toughest creatures to actually work on.
The dinosaur stampede was a sequence that we dreamed up about 10 years ago. And so finally, when we got the opportunity to do King Kong, I wanted to get that sequence onto film.
The majority of the sequence was done on a miniature that was quite large.
The Brontosaurus stampede was comprised of several different big models. I mean, they basically were what you could fit on a stage.
The actual gorge was over 100 meters long, not all shot at once, shot a piece at a time as we traveled down the gorge.
We shot a lot of the miniature elements just as architectural elements, and then we shot the foliage either as separate elements or did it as digital elements, and we just glued that to the walls everywhere, so that as you were running through it, you had this amazing interaction.
You've then got the incredible art department sets on which the live-action performers would play out their roles.
We're shooting humans, real humans, being chased by digital dinosaurs who will be included into the scene at a later time for safety's sake.
We looked at where Adrien would suddenly flinch and jump out of the way or where Jack would swerve, and we thought, okay, that's where a foot needs to go. So there was a lot of reverse engineering.
And then as well, there are treadmills that were set up with a green screen behind it.
I've run 2 kilometers on the treadmill so far, averaging probably like 13 kilometers per hour.
I got up to 15. All right, okay, I needed oxygen afterwards, but I did get to 15.
Some people coming back from the treadmills, they didn't look so good. They had been out there for a long time.
No, man, stop. I've been doing a lot of Stairmaster, but what I should have been doing with this treadmill. If I was running away from dinosaurs, running upstairs, I could do it all day.
We then were able to take the treadmill information, depending on how fast the actors were actually running, and put the camera into the miniature, so we combined the two together.
Then you've got, of course, the digital doubles of the actors.
The digital doubles were hard. We made a huge effort to make them look completely photoreal.
Aging less do this.
Here it goes. When we're creating a digital double, the first thing we do is do a full body scan of the actor.
Sure, I can't pose like this.
So we get a 3D representation of the actor that you can spin all the way around.
Looks great. Who are we kidding? They're going to replace me. When they see this scan, they're going to get a new actor. Lickety split.
The most important thing is the digital face. So for that, we have a separate scanner, which is a little bit higher resolution. Anne is probably the most prolific digital double that we had in Kong. She was used in a large number of scenes simply because she had to interact with Kong.
And we did most of the Skull Island crew, and as they died, they usually ended up turning into a digital double at some point.
We had to figure out who dies and when, and why that's important is because we're shooting out of order. And so we had to sort of map out the journey through the island and the body count, who gets it and how they get it and when they get it.
Spider fodder.
There's actually quite a high body count in the movie. I mean, so high that I was worried whether there'd be anyone left to sail the ship home.
With the Brontos, one of the big influences was actually the mama kill from Return of the King.
We had these two mama kills that just collapsed into each other into this great big heap. And what looked good with two must look even better with, you know, a dozen.
And it was just a disaster from a creature and animation standpoint.
Just trying to get the bodies to move right and getting the skin to kind of slide across the muscles. And when the legs come down like this, you get a bit of shake.
And trying to keep track of a leg from one Bronto, keeping it in between two other Brontos' bellies, and yet sticking out in the right place was just a complete nightmare.
That sort of things are a real tremendous challenge for the artists working on the shot. And, you know, all of that was trying to just make this thing one step beyond what you'd seen before.
It existed in my imagination for quite a long time, and it was great to finally be able to put it out into film and make it look pretty real and authentic.
And action!
I look at the film that Peter's created today, and I look back at the 1933 version, and I like to think that Peter's basically gone back to Skull Island with colour film in his camera, and we've revisited this world that we already knew.
Skull Island is one of those places that I have always wanted to visit ever since I was a kid. So I just feel now, all these years later, that I have made my visit to Skull Island. I have been there, I've visited the place, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. I'd be very happy to go back again, in actual fact. The skyline of New York in 1933 is very different to the skyline today, so it was literally just impossible for us to contemplate shooting the film in New York for real. To turn New York today into something from 1933 is such a daunting, almost impossible task, because there aren't really a lot of old sections of New York left.
The basic structure is still there, but everywhere you look, the signage has changed, streetlights have changed.
Once you start looking at even a single image of New York from on top of the Empire State Building, you realize that you would have to paint out almost everything to try and get it back to what it looked like in 1933.
The thought of going to New York and closing streets down, one, it would be prohibitive cost-wise. Secondly, it almost logistically impossible.
Yeah, we would never have got everything. We would never have been able to go to Times Square and get that the way we want it to be, or Herald Square, or anything like that.
And so you say, well, what do? Do you shoot it on a backlot somewhere? You know, there's a universal backlot that's New York.
I wanted to do the opposite to what the backlot gives you, which is a very narrow street, very restricted. At the end of the road, there's always a cross street because they need to block off the road before you can see too far, and that's the nature of what a backlot studio set is like. The thing with the real New York City, of course, is these great avenues and boulevards that just go for blocks and blocks and blocks. You can look right the way down 3 miles. I wanted that to be the New York that was in King Kong.
From quite early on, we realised that the best way of going about doing this is to reconstruct it.
Well, the last conversation we had, we talked about locations that we went to, and then we said that on the other hand, it might just be better to build it. Our thought was always to have New York under our control, 100%, in other words, build it ourselves.
And if you're going to build it, why not build it in New Zealand?
We've ended up in Seaview. We've ended up on a site that used to have a petrochemical plant on it. Other than that, it's actually quite a good site. I mean, we've got plenty of room around it.
New York in 1933 just doesn't exist anymore. We needed so much of New York that we just decided, well, we're just going to have to build it ourselves.
Obviously, it had to have fidelity to the period. New Yorkers had to look at it and feel comfortable that they're looking at their own city.
One of the things I quite like, I must admit, about this is that you actually don't you don't have this theatre on either sides of it. I actually quite like the fact that the sandwich shop right next door to the...
We used an amazing amount of old photos and things to figure out what New York looked like at the time. What did Times Square look like during New Year's Eve? What did Times Square look like during the day? We found out what the most popular cars were in 1933 and what the most popular colors were and got color swatches.
Bright greens, yellows, the yellow cabs obviously, but green cars, possibly red. In the art department, there was a whole end dedicated to New York.
It was a colorful world that they lived in, and you kind of forget that because you see it all through this black and white filter. And so we tried to bring that all back.
All the way through this research period, you're researching it, but you're also thinking of how you're going to build it. The New York streets was a great example that it's one thing to say, well, okay, we're going to have to build a set of New York, but hey, what is a set of New York? How long is it? How many streets is it? How tall are the buildings? There was all these questions that have to be answered.
But I guess we eventually have to figure out if we wanted the front entrance of the Empire State Building to be anywhere too.
Yes. I was very keen to use this intersection of Broadway and the avenues that go through Times Square to give us a sort of a wedge shape that gives us a sort of a more intricate street layout.
We thought pretty ingeniously about how we could design our street sets to incorporate the needs of the script in a relatively small space.
King Kong.
We're standing on 5th Avenue. It's not only 5th Avenue, it's also 6th Avenue and 7th Avenue, depending on which part of the script we're dealing with.
Thank you for my...
So we had to change from the sort of brownstone area into the burlesque theatre area, into the vaudeville theatre, into...
Times Square. At one stage, we're doing Herald Square, which is where Macy's is.
Of all the incredible sets, the New York set is without a doubt the most impressive. It's New York. But they only built the first 20 feet. And then the rest of it they'll do with computers later.
So if you just sort of walked around like this, you just sort of go, oh, wow, man. It's gonna be so cool once they put everything above my arm in digitally.
Now, why would I want to do that when we can talk about it in person?
Because that's what a smart... We only built the first floor of New York. And we figured then that anything we wanted to see above that, we could just extend digitally, as well as anything we saw down the street, we could extend digitally.
It's just an audition, that's all.
You wanted to be able to pan and tilt and look in any direction without any hindrance whatsoever.
The challenge that we had in digital was that there was only a limited amount of blocks that were built there. And beyond that is the ocean, and there's mountains. And we had to extend the streets so that it is, true to New York, and you see all the streets going off into the horizon. Our team of modelers, the first step was for them to create buildings to match the existing ones that were on set, to extend past the first floor, to add in the windows, the ledges.
I guess it comes down to the scale of the theatres on this end.
For the digital set extensions, it was important to work with Grant Major because these were an extension of the buildings that he had created. He was continuing to design and continuing to give us feedback as we built the buildings.
Because our drawings would be passed on to the digital people to marry in the exact transition points between physical set and digital extensions.
One of the challenges with making our movie was to actually recreate the crowdedness of the streets and the busyness of the streets, because the streets are absolutely jam-packed with cars, with trams, with buses, and thousands of people.
A little bit further down here before we turn around and come back. Okay?
The art department filled up as much as they could with people and period cars and extras and costumes, and then we would just fill in the rest digitally and blend the two together using Massive, which was a system we developed for Lord of the Rings for doing big crowd technology. It's an artificial intelligence system, so we create these agents that have a brain, they have eyes and ears, and they can kind of think and respond in certain ways to what's around them.
We utilised Massive for both pedestrians on the street who were taught, rather than fight like orcs, they were taught to walk like New Yorkers. Some people might say there's not much of a difference. We also use it for the traffic as well, for the cars, and so each of our vehicles had a little massive driver inside the vehicle who was trained in how to drive an automobile in 1933. And you get some pretty erratic behaviour, which, you know, gives you the perfect New York experience.
The biplane battle was actually one of the first sequences that we had turned over to us. And just taking the first look at it, we realized we have to build a city in 3D. We wanted to give Peter that flexibility. I mean, he wants to be able to place the camera wherever he wants. He wants to be able to travel around. He wants to be able to fly over the city and to not have any constraints whatsoever. So we wanted to have ultimate flexibility. And the only way to do that was to basically build the entire city.
Being tasked with creating a photoreal city, you know, a city as complex as New York, it's a daunting prospect. The thing that kickstarted the process for us was a commercially available data set of the city as it stands now.
That gave us a representation of what all the modern buildings were in three-dimensional space. I believe the map was down to a meter accuracy in terms of the placement, the shapes, the height of the building. But the problem with this map is that it is modern New York, and what we needed to do was to retrofit it and to basically make it work for 1933 New York. So to do that, we obtained additional statistical data from another company, which gave us the information about each building, when it was built, and what type of building it was.
And you can see that we were able to distinguish which buildings were built in 1933 or before, and which ones were built after, and they're color-coded by the orange is before 1933 and the blue is after 1933.
And basically we just removed anything that was modern.
And we're left with these big gaping holes in the city.
We didn't have any statistical data or any kind of data at that time. The only thing we did have was reference photos.
So we found all these aerial photographs of New York from the 30s, and we figured out what cameras they were taken from, and we matched the cameras. We overlaid our city on the photos, and we looked at all the buildings that were missing, and we could say, aha.
These would be the buildings that would have been torn down, and new buildings have since replaced them.
We could then go and by hand and build cubes or low-resolution geometry that matched the profile of the buildings that were there. We had at least a cube for every building on Manhattan Island.
I would guess tens of thousands of buildings that had to be replaced.
And that was what became the Guide Geo.
So once we had the Guide Geo, the next step was to actually build the city. It's virtually impossible for anyone to go in by hand and build every single one of those buildings. We knew that was impossible.
And what we had to do by necessity is we had to write our own computer program that built the buildings for us in an automated kind of way. It's called the building bot.
So this is just all being built by the bot?
Yeah. The building bot would march along the various blocks and buildings and basically replace what was very kind of low-resolution Guide Geo with high-resolution, detailed buildings.
We had to build it neighborhood by neighborhood. So we wrote this software that would look at the neighborhood, for example, around the Flatiron building and say, okay, right, there's a lot of office space here, so it probably had this kind of architecture.
We actually went and reviewed what were the architectural styles of that time. Was this a federal style or was this a Beaux Arts style? And what part of the city is this style used in? So the bot, when it actually went in and would construct buildings, it would look at the appropriate style of what it should be.
And then we needed to get the detail in there. We didn't know which buildings we were going to be close to, so we had to detail all of them.
From our study of what New York looked like at the time, we built this library of architectural elements, doorways, windows, ledges.
These became little things that we called cells.
But yeah, all of these little things here would all be individual cells that would be built out of this stuff here.
What the bot does is it chooses from these pieces and it puts it together to construct a building.
We would turn on the software and run it and just let it build all the buildings and see what they look like. We'd compare them to the photos and see if it got it right or if it got it wrong. And we'd just keep teaching it to develop buildings in the architectural style of each of the neighborhoods of New York.
The windows are still reading fairly well. You know, expect that to get better.
So we used that technique to build all of New York and parts of New Jersey and Brooklyn.
At a certain point, we kind of transitioned into a matte painting. But for those first several rows of buildings and houses, it was important that we create those as 3D elements as well.
Because we needed to actually see those in a lot of the aerial photography we were doing.
We created easily over 100,000 three-dimensional buildings were built for the film. This is what you see in the color is an overlay where we're checking our digital over top of it. It was important for us that if you align our reference photos with the skyline of New York, that the end result would match what 1933 New York was.
This gave us a New York that we could actually fly up to or down to ground level. And anywhere we wanted to go, we could point the camera and say, right, build that part for me because I need to see it. And the system would just build it for us.
We were able to do what effectively became digital location scouting.
When Denham and Preston are running from the investors, we just decided, well, let's get a long view here. Why don't we just look down Fifth Avenue? So we put a camera on Fifth Avenue shooting south, and that's our view. There's a little bit of set, just a few blocks that are visible, but the rest of it is New York in 1933.
In our opening sequence, we basically took our computer model of New York and we utilized it in recreating some of these newsreel images.
Peter really wanted to copy these pieces of archival film exactly.
We would go in and we'd match the shots as faithfully as we could, make things just a little bit more cinematic.
There's a great shot of two tugs out on the Hudson. I've seen the original black and white shot, and the digital version in colour is pretty close. You know, I mean, if you didn't know, you would think it was just a colorized piece of film.
I visited New York, but here was an opportunity to really get to know the city. And we spent so much time in the virtual New York space that I feel I know the city much more than I did before. I guess I know a 1933 version of the city, so I'm going to find that a little bit disorientating next time I go there.
Besides building all the different sections of New York, we also needed to build key signature buildings.
We identified between 60 and 100 buildings that still existed in 1933 that exist today that are instantly recognizable.
The modeling team probably did a couple hundred buildings by hand.
We're not kind of letting the computer build these automatically. We're actually going in and using blueprints, and we're digitally modeling these buildings in a much more kind of hand-built fashion.
Such as the Woolworth Building,
The Helmsley,
the Rockefeller Center,
the library,
the Waldorf Astoria,
the Chrysler Building,
the Penn Station,
or the Flatiron Building.
And then obviously the big one was the Empire State Building itself, the hero digital building asset for the whole show.
We knew that was going to be the focal point of the big scene at the end of the film. And we just decided to go back to square one and figure out, you know, how the building was built. So we actually got the original architectural blueprints for the building.
And so we were able to, floor by floor, follow the blueprints and construct the building in exactly the same dimensions and scale as it was in 1933.
And it has all sorts of chrome and red window frames and details that you don't really realise until you get up really close.
That whole platform wasn't there. No, that's the
Now the entire top of the Empire State Building has been, you know, to me it's been spoiled.
It's changed dramatically from when it was first completed in 1933.
I mean, it had beautiful deco kind of lines to it, and now there's all these radio masts and antennae.
You could actually match the blueprints to the photos, both old and new, and see how that it had changed. So we went back and made it look like the original one did.
It's nice to see it in our movie as it originally was designed to look. The digital version of the Empire State Building, I think, took something like 18 months to build. The actual Empire State Building took 14 months to build. They built theirs quicker than we could build ours.
As we were building New York, you know, we had another team working at the same time on how to take it down, how to destroy it.
Bam. It's gotta hurt.
Ray Horsfield and his team, they called themselves the Bomb Squad. They were busy figuring out how to tear things apart.
Yeah, they loved it. They had a great time.
After all the destruction work I did on Return of the King, I personally got a bit of a taste for blowing stuff up. So this is involving destruction from all aspects. We've got vehicular stuff going on, flying glass, debris, these awnings. The most common methodology for destruction was a rebuild. Mostly things would be rebuilt in a particular way that would allow them to be destroyed more readily.
Obviously, you break something open, you see the inside of it, so anything that was going to break couldn't just be a shell that was built for external appearance only. It had to have a whole internal structure that was revealed when it was destroyed.
We had to do this on a number of things, you know, like the Alhambra Theatre on the inside. Or even the outside, when Kong jumps out through his sign. Each one of those pieces needed to be reconstructed based on how they were going to break. It was 3 frames that Kong had to get through the inner cinema wall, 2 layers of bricks, 1 layer of concrete, then there was a wooden infrastructural wall, and then there's 3 layers of signage. And so, okay, he's completely inside, 3 frames later, he's on the other side of all of this stuff. He must have been breaking the sound barrier because his debris was actually going light speed.
The reason why we went to this much trouble to build Manhattan and the computer and the Empire State Building was obviously for the climax of the film. The aerial attack on Kong is one of the great iconic sequences in film. It was the scene that I worried about the most. It was the first scene that we did pre-visualization for because I didn't want it to be the last scene that got worked on and got kind of rushed. I wanted it to have the most amount of time spent on it. It was an obvious sequence for me to do a cameo, largely as a tribute to the original film because the directors of the 1933 Kong, Miriam Cooper and Ernest Schoedsack, did their cameo as the pilot and the gunner of one of the attacking planes.
Peter came up with an idea. He, you know, friends and people who were going to be visiting at certain times thought it would be fun to put them in the Helldiver as pilots and or gunners. You know there's all these famous people standing around you, but you can't recognise them. Peter hasn't got his beard and he's wearing his helmet and nobody knows who they are except me, really. So that's kind of fun. It's like my little secret.
How old is the beard? That's what I want to know.
12 years.
12 years.
All right, let's get these things off.
Uh-huh. You're a braver man than I am. I'll follow you.
Well, I don't know where we're going.
No, we're going up here. All
right. They get to go first. Because this is a once-in-a-lifetime kind of deal, I'm thinking.
That's okay. Yep.
Yeah, if you don't mind.
Oh, look, Frank's just going to go for it. Let's take a picture with his moustache. Oh God, I look like some 80s porn star, yeah. Now we got to do the Fuhrer moustache. Come on, let's do that. Yeah.
Now you know you're looking like Chaplin, man.
It's a Charlie Chaplin, that's right, it's the Charlie Chaplin look. Charlie Chaplin look. The little tramp.
He's definitely having second thoughts. But
Yeah.
we think it looks good. Come on,
I think
man.
it's all a bit late now to have second thoughts.
Yeah,
Like,
I
well,
know.
I was having second thoughts, but then I thought...
He looked very handsome too, we thought. He didn't look like Peter. He looked about 9 years old, I think, when all that happened.
Nikki, yeah?
Look at that. That's great.
That's fantastic.
No. Nothing to laugh about. It's a very traumatic experience, very traumatic. Be very careful not to shoot your tail off, because if you come around here, then you're going to be shooting your own tail, which was a problem in those days. So just have to be careful when we're shooting at the ape that we just get them clear of the aeroplane. So I got to be in the back seat of the plane, and flying my plane was actually Rick Baker. Wonderful connection there is that it was Rick who was in the Kong costume in the 1976 King Kong. Rick built the costume and spent the entire film in this ape suit. Rick here has the biggest conflict because he played King Kong in 1976, didn't you, Rick?
And I wanted to kill him then, too.
Right, so he gets to kill him today, and we get to finish shooting it. Everybody's a winner today. Everybody's a winner, except for Kong. We also have Frank Darabont, who's obviously a great director of the Shawshank Redemption, The Green Mile. Frank's a huge Kong aficionado. I didn't really want to get through this movie without inviting Frank down to New Zealand to do a cameo.
Hey, I came halfway around the world to do this. I would have swum.
And Rick Porras, who was our co-producer on all 3 Lord of the Rings movies.
Some of the shells would be flying overhead and kind of hitting you on the top of the head, so it was good to have our little leather skull caps, but it just was great. Not difficult to act in the moment with those guns blaring.
We also had Randy Cook, our second unit director, who's a wonderful stop-motion animator in his own right.
There's a big monkey up there. We've got to deal with it.
Our pilot is Jim Dietz, who's a very renowned military artist.
He's been flying for a long time, eh, Jim?
Long time. I'm 22, but it's aged me tremendously.
That was the coolest thing I've ever done.
So John, it's gonna be flying, and then it'll be doing a bit of this. And it's strange trying to direct a movie from being in the backseat of a plane too, because every time we did a shot, they'd have to wheel the monitor in to show me, because it is so specific with the planes moving around and the camera moving that you really don't know if you've got something that's usable until you see it back. You know, you do have to look at it played back. You tackle one difficult part of the film, like recreating New York and the thousands of man-hours that are spent on that, and it's a difficult thing to do, and it occupies so much time and attention. And even getting to the point that you are excited and you're happy with the way that New York is looking, you know, for a film like Kong, you've only just scratched the surface because you've still got a giant gorilla to have to create. In some movies, you have one particular facet of the film that has got to succeed or the entire film fails. Now, you know, sometimes you can get away with a slightly dodgy performance, or you can get away with a set that isn't quite as good as you had in your mind. You can get away with a costume that's not quite as good. But in our case, King Kong, the creature, had to be 100% successful. If he was 75% successful, the movie would suffer.
Bringing Kong to life the pressure was immense.
I don't know how we did it. I really don't know how we did it, but like with a lot of things, failure is not an option.
It's daunting because you're working with a treasured property that you want to honour and not spoil for a new generation of filmgoers.
There's a lot of people out there that love the original Kong, will always love it, but at the same time, they're excited and they want to see what we can do.
That probably was the scariest part, was knowing that, you know, everybody was looking at us to get it right.
I sort of caught myself at moments when I was doing this. It's like, okay, this is King Kong, and you're like, okay, I don't want to mess this up.
One of the biggest challenges with doing Kong is to get empathy into the title character, you know, of King Kong himself.
One of Peter Jackson's goals was that Kong wasn't a monster. He was an actual misunderstood creature.
But anybody that has seen the original 1933 Kong realizes that he's a lot more than just a movie monster. He has a heart, he has a soul. story of King Kong is often described as a Beauty and the Beast story, and whilst that's certainly true, we actually looked in a few different places for inspiration when we were developing our screenplay.
One afternoon we sat down and watched Charles Laughton in The Hunchback of Notre Dame.
And we did feel there was a lot of Kong contained within that story as well. Not just the Beauty and the Beast aspects, but the idea of this outcast, this very lonely person who connects and has an empathetic relationship with this young woman. It's very Kong-like.
When we started thinking about Kong, we studied a lot of gorillas. And one of the things that you realize is that gorillas are extremely social animals. They live in very close-knit social groups. And so for a gorilla to be alone for any long period of time is like being in solitary confinement for a human. It would drive them absolutely crazy.
We assume that Kong is the last surviving member of his species. He had a mother and a father and maybe brothers and sisters, but they're dead.
And his innate desire is to communicate and to, to socialize, but with what? There's nothing left.
He's a very lonely creature, absolutely solitary. It must be one of the most loneliest existences you could ever possibly imagine.
For him to have survived for so long alone is quite tragic.
Solitary gorillas tend to go insane with depression, and maybe that explains some of his violent temperament, which you don't see as often in real-world gorillas.
In creating a character like Kong, it's important to have some concept of where he comes from, of what his story is. Now, none of this actually makes it into the film, and nor should it make it into the film, but you have to know it in order to be able to go through the processes of creating his character, both from a script point of view and from a design point of view.
I was concerned about what I knew would be a very lengthy design process to get Kong ultimately to the screen. And that's indeed what has in fact been the case.
Looking at the maquettes from 1996, I thought that we hadn't really captured character in them. We'd done some beautiful studies of what a very peaceful-looking gorilla could be like, but I don't think we were quite doing the right thing with Kong. I came to realize that he needed to be very ugly. He needed to be a brute, much more scary looking.
The idea was to make him feel like this sort of old kind of punch-drunk boxer.
Meets mountain man, meets, crazed hermit.
One of the things that Peter gave us as a lead was his love of an albino gorilla that was in a Spanish zoo called Snowflake.
He looked like an old man. He was much more wrinkled than what a normal gorilla is.
His were almost pillowy, they're quite puffy and stuff, and he just had a lot of character to his face.
So as that is our primary lead, we began designing Kong's face. It was actually Gus Hunter who really started to capture the gorilla that Peter visualized.
That one piece of artwork is something that everybody kind of went off on, including Jamie Beswarwick and Miles Tevis when they were doing the sculpting of Kong.
Miles Tevis and Jamie Beswarwick worked in tandem designing this character, and we workshopped the gorilla's face over many months.
I wanted physically to see the history, on his body.
I mean, what say we really kind of get brave.
I mean, Peter himself actually did a lot of the scarring. He just grabbed a tool and started carving into it. So you're like, okay, oh, great, here's the scars.
I thought about having his skull fractured at some point, which has sort of caused one eye to droop down.
And then all of a sudden, Peter's like, well, no, cave in the eye here. And you're like, what? No, it's like...
It still doesn't quite have a dramatic, it's there, but it doesn't have a sort of three-dimensionally dramatic kind of impact,
Peter actually pushed us further and further until we got to a point where we actually broke the bone of the socket and shifted it slightly, dropping the eye a few millimeters out of sync with the other eye.
I don't think I've ever really believed in this lower lip with a snaggletooth yet. I think it's a nice idea.
He's like, okay, I really want the jaw twisted. So you're like, okay, you twist the jaw slightly. It's like, no. I really, really want it like this.
Something like that.
And they're like, oh, okay, wow.
We had a little pet pug called Monster, who was a little bit inbred. It's a sort of a Chinatown story, really. Her parents were brothers and sisters and should never really have gotten together. But unfortunately it happened, and Monster came out a little bit deformed, and she had this really quaint little crooked jaw and a little snaggletooth.
And that's indeed what Kong's asymmetrical jaw, broken jaw, hangtooth was actually based on in the end. We realised from the outset that our Kong was going to be a giant silverback gorilla, but because he has grown to such massive proportions, things have to change. His stance, his structure, his proportional ratios between his head and his body. We've kept the head a little bit smaller than a real gorilla because it made him feel taller. He felt too small.
Definitely quite a few liberties taken there with the anatomy. Like he's definitely not a true gorilla. His feet are actually a lot larger and a lot more splayed than a regular gorilla. So that when he did stand upright, that he would feel quite solid, you know, in doing that. He wouldn't look too kind of top heavy.
He's going to want to take up this stance, even though we may not see him in the stance a great deal. This is how the creature was born.
Yes, right.
So,
and working from this is
just amazing things like the spine.
You are going to
dropping.
see him in the stance. You'll see him in the stance more than any other stance, you know.
We gave him a very heavy sway back, as if his belly muscles had dragged his backbone down. It's just dramatic how much their spine collapses, their gut hangs down. We ultimately got to a place that Pete approved the design. He was happy with it as a static model.
But, as often happens, as soon as you start to animate it, you realize there's a different character there than the one that you thought.
Once you're seeing Kong on the computer, there is still an ongoing design process, because things that worked as a clay sculpture or things that worked as a sketch suddenly don't work as well when you see him moving around. And so the design of Kong, as the design of Gollum did exactly the same thing, it carries on in the computer world.
When we have this design of Kong and we start to get the digital model into place, one of the first things we start to do is locomotion test, so that we can make sure that Kong can actually physically do the things that he's expected to do.
We needed to have him look very noble in an all-fours pose, but we also needed to have him very regal and believable in a bipedal pose.
And it was actually quite difficult to get the balance between a design that would work as a quadruped and a design that would work in a bipedal way.
Because at the end of the day, Kong has to be able to run, he has to be able to climb buildings, he has to be able to swing hanging on one arm, he has to be able to do all this convincingly. Body proportions changed nearly constantly.
The sway back was one of the first things that had to go. It looked great in the design, but it just didn't work in the actual puppet when he had to move around. And we wanted him to feel very strong. We really beefed up his shoulders and things, kind of matching to a real gorilla.
And we found that when he tried to close his jaw, his teeth wouldn't really mesh.
So we had to rein the tooth back in, we had to straighten the jaw back out some so that we actually could work with it.
It was a challenge to figure out exactly just how big the sagittal crest should be on Kong. Another huge challenge and problem was the eyes, because with most gorillas, the brows stick out so far. So it was a matter of taking back the brow shape a bit so that we always saw the eyes.
It's just little things like that you don't often think are going to trip you up, but they become the problem that you've got to try to figure out.
We spent a lot of time working on Kong's fur. You know, we thought when we were doing Gollum that was really hard to do human skin. Well, it turns out doing fur is even much harder, because it's one of those things that you're so used to seeing every day that it's really hard to not get it right, because you'll spot it a mile away. We started off by looking at a lot of gorillas and a lot of, references, and, Workshop did the head of Kong for us on a small scale where they punched in all the hairs.
And this stuff was just more or less just for reference for what a digital, so they could see the direction that the hair is growing and also the length of it.
They were also used not only for lighting reference, but we were also able to use them for dynamics reference.
Of air blowing against it, just to see how the hair actually moves in the wind. And also we had a tank where we would submerge it into the tank.
Just sort of fling it out real fast and try to see what the hair does, see how the water cascades off of it.
And so it was priceless kind of information for them.
At the same time, we were grappling with the whole issue of, he's a 25-foot gorilla. What do his hairs look like? Are they as thick as cables? How will his hairs look when we compare them to Anne?
Especially the scenes when you have Anne and Kong's hand with all the hair around here, you couldn't have these giant pieces of rope sticking out.
If we scale it all the way back down to the size of the width of the hair on a real ape, he starts to look like the softest, fluffiest cat you've ever seen, which instantly destroys the character of Kong. The coloration of Kong actually changed a lot of times. We play this game of going from black to brown to blue to black to brown. You know, we just kept on going in circles, but it was kind of like a spiral. You're not going in circles, you're just sort of refining onto it until you hit the target.
The design process on Kong ended up being very, very similar to what our Gollum experience was, right down to the fact that we released a trailer that had images of Kong, as we had done with Gollum, and we ended up changing the design after we saw the trailer.
If you compare the trailer Kong versus the film Kong, it's actually a totally different creature.
It was unfortunate that it had to be released like that, but we just ran out of time, so we had to give them what we had.
Kong had been seen by the world, and we were still redesigning him.
Kong's design certainly was a process, and it was a process where, you know, like anything that involves big special effects, you have a large group of people. So the danger of that is it becomes a little bit of a committee. And as Kong developed through the much more refined, you know, technical pipelines to be made to look realistic, he started to drift off course a little bit.
All these small tweaks had been made till Pete had kind of, you know, he didn't really sort of know, you know, what had happened.
We had lost something of the power of Kong. The translation had been such that, you know, he was becoming a bit weak.
Peter and Fran weren't completely happy with the look of Kong.
We liked the Kong that we had in our previs, as crude as he was. In our minds, he was really well proportioned. I mean, he had a power in his shoulders, he had a bulk.
Our new Kong, he didn't have the same strength that the previous puppet had.
And he started to look like a bodybuilder. He looked a little bit like this isn't a natural creature.
I mean, the main issue with Kong was that he didn't have the characteristics of being a solid, chunky, slightly overweight gorilla. The final thing that sort of nailed Kong's design came down to a couple of pictures of these gorillas that Pete and Fran responded really well to. And it was like, you know, okay, make them look like that.
We found this beautiful reference of the Umagumi ape from the IMAX film.
So we got all the pictures we could of Umagumi and said, this is our body shape, this is our proportion, this is the strength and power that we want to see in Kong.
And at that point, it just kind of clicked. We finally had our sigh of relief and said, okay, I think we finally got our Kong.
It got a little bit worrying for a while. We just felt that we'd lost something.
And it seems so simple now, but as soon as he started looking like a real gorilla, everyone was happy. It was like, hey, that's what he should look like, a real gorilla. Yep, you're right. Why was that so hard?
And that took a long time to figure all that out. Probably close to a year from start to finish before we really got the character of Kong working.
Kong is the hero of this picture, and he had to be right. So it's no surprise that, you know, he was noodled and fiddled with right to the end.
Of course, the physical design of Kong is only half the character. You know, what he looks like, it's how he performs, how he behaves is going to very much be the job of a skilled actor. And so that's where Andy Serkis comes into the story.
Guess who's back?
Well, I was overwhelmed and very excited and kind of, at one, sort of shocked at the prospect of playing another CG character.
In his mind, Kong was a real gorilla and needed to be a real gorilla. And, you know, he had to get under the skin of a real gorilla.
And I immediately started to watch as many videos, of course, about gorillas and read up on books and just get into the world of the gorilla. I went to London Zoo. I then got to know the gorillas. So there was Bob, who was the male, who was brought in as part of a breeding program. He didn't like me because I'd formed quite a strong relationship with one of the females called Zaire. We got on very, very well, and she sort of formed an attachment to me, to the point that when my wife, Lorraine, came down, Zaire saw her out of the corner of her eye and didn't like what she saw and the way that Lorraine and I were interacting, and she got a water bottle and she just pounded it and sprayed Lorraine with this water. She claimed me. I mean, there's no two ways about it. She claimed me. And Bob really wasn't having any of it. He would jump up and punch the cage every time I walked past. You know, he'd literally leave the ground, he'd thump the cage. And he was terrifying. He was absolutely terrifying.
I remember meeting up with Andy in a hotel in London and having a conversation with him about Kong. And in this meeting, he just threw in a casual kind of way, you know, how useful it would be for him to go to Rwanda and go visit the gorillas in the wild.
Because I just thought there's got to be a major difference between gorillas in captivity and gorillas in the wild. There just has to be.
And I just sort of scoffed at it. You know, you're not going to want to do it, that, Andy. It's like, you know, we could never get you insured because with your actors, you have to sort of cover, you know, everybody with insurance.
Rwanda is the only place to see mountain gorillas. They don't exist anywhere else. There's only around 680 left.
I knew that Rwanda would cause problems for the production, and so I sort of shot the idea down the minute it came out of Andy's mouth.
I kind of thought, I still want to go to Rwanda, but I just kept it quiet.
As you can imagine, the horror that we all felt when our producer, Jan Blanken, calls me up one day and said, did you know that Andy's in Rwanda? And I said, what? Yeah, he's just gone over there. He's paid for the trip himself. He's up in the mountains right now with the gorillas. Oh, my God.
And the little bugger, he didn't tell anybody.
Oh, man.
Gone. He just left and he's gone there. None of us were sort of... None of us knew anything about it. He actually didn't give anyone a choice. He just bolted off there at the weekend. Wow. So that's where he's now.
He went to Rwanda, and he was pulling a full Carl Denham, going up too close and filming them.
It's impressive and it's scary and it makes you feel like maybe you should take your job a little bit more seriously.
I'm so glad I went because seeing gorillas in their natural habitat is just so extraordinary and you feel very privileged, and actually that's what it was all about. It was seeing social animals interact. They taught me all about gorilla vocalizations. They have a call between them all, which is that kind of sound, which is like, I'm all right, are you okay? Everybody's kind of communicating with each other. They have to move when they chest beat. And when they chest beat, they beat their chests with cupped hands as opposed to clenched fists.
And they actually use the hollow of their palm to...
Which was one of the big things in the movie where I think we've moved into poetic license because Pete wants him, like the original. The homage is the original kind of, you know, closed fist.
Now, we weren't going to go completely with the fists closed and make it, you know, make it too human. So we had to find a nice middle ground, which is kind of halfway between cupping and fists.
The most important thing I learned, really, from observing gorillas, both at London Zoo and in Rwanda, was that when you talk about studying gorillas, it's like saying you're studying human beings because they're as totally different, idiosyncratic as you or I. You know, you'll have a very moody gorilla, you'll have a very loving gorilla, you'll have a very uptight gorilla, you'll have a very relaxed gorilla. You know, I mean, they have personalities exactly like you or I, and why should we think any different?
When he arrived in New Zealand, having made this journey, it was a wonderful chance for us to just drain him of information.
You look well, man.
Yeah, well, I've been trying to get myself fit for this movie.
God, gee.
You know that Andy went to the gorillas, the wild gorillas?
No. So we've just come back from Rwanda. I just went to Rwanda. Oh, yeah.
He had some great stories of just being with the gorillas and being so close to some of them.
Wow, so how close were you able to get to them? Oh, I mean, they were all around. They were nudging me out of the way, though, honestly.
And were you filming from that sort of...
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's
Oh, yeah. Fantastic. Wow. Yeah,
so we'll get to see all that after,
it
all gets digitized?
And he came back with a wealth of video footage, the best reference, actually, that we had of mountain gorillas.
And so the first thing we started doing was just swapping footage that he had made of them and really trying to understand, you know, what was going on in the gorilla's mind.
I was able to then begin to make character choices, apart from learning behaviour per se. But I guess it was quite frightening because it was, okay, so actually, who is Kong after it all? It wasn't like it narrowed it down, it opened it up.
I really wanted a human actor to be making the decisions that a performer would normally make if they were playing a role. I wanted somebody to be on set for Naomi to perform with, and so all those things were possible by casting Andy Serkis.
We're here on the big wall Kong set here. It's kind of a big day for us today. It's the first day that we're going to have Andy Serkis on set playing Kong.
Today is very special because he finally gets to unveil his inner Kong.
Quite nervous, actually, I have to say, today, because this is the first time on set. You know, it's kind of in a way back to Voyage of Discovery time.
He wanted to physically be able to recreate a gorilla. He had teeth made.
Pete's showing you the teeth anyway. I'm not going to laugh. I'm not going to laugh.
He looked a little bit like a character out of a very cheap werewolf horror movie.
Very good.
I mean, it's all greasing the wheels, as we said, but, you know.
Greasing the wheels, yeah? It's like greasing the wheels to me.
And it reminded me so much of the first day that I turned up on set as Gollum in my skin-tight outfit, and he giggled and made me feel really good.
He turned up on set to play Gollum, and a lot of people, crew and actors, everyone sort of went, what's he doing? So Andy turned up on set as Kong and get in his gorilla outfit with his arm extensions, and a lot of the crew and cast went, what's he doing?
Felt a little bit nervous and a little bit kind of, you know, silly.
But then you get to think of him like a little gorilla. You know, he used to take my hand and come for a walk with me, you know, around studios.
It's time to Mike the man, the mighty man of Kong.
Just give us a blaster, Andy.
This is the Kongalizer.
Maximum volume.
There was no point of him being a gorilla if he couldn't sound like one.
This amazing rig could make his voice much deeper, make his voice box sound much bigger, and, you know, depending on what he was doing, make his chest sound kind of quite big as well.
It's like puppeteering your own voice, and it's really freaky. It's very, very freaky.
It scared the hell out of me when it went on the stage one day and he was roaring out.
And that was actually really quite impressive and helpful.
Save up a really good big roar for when I go 3, 2, 1, smash.
Yeah.
And the smash is your kind of grand entrance.
Okay, cool.
Kong's presence finally was there as a tool for the other actors to play off.
They were kind of quite mesmerised by what I was giving them. They were actually quite shocked.
Andy, I don't know if I've ever met a sweeter guy. I was so scared. He is so insane. As King Kong, he is not a human. He is freaking me out. He starts going apeshit.
Suddenly Kong became so much bigger, you know, just in our imagination.
And the people who were really paying attention to what was going on went, ah, that's what Andy's doing.
Look what the motion capture department gave me. For a present, first day of Kong. Bananas.
And then we took that to the last step, which was recreating it in the studio with the final pictures, with Andy doing like an ADR session.
This huge 3-day epic ADR session in LA. I think it's fair to say that my vocal cords haven't recovered from it since, in all honesty. The most successful stuff, I think, ended up being the breath, actually.
It became the backbone for the Kong vocal.
I mean, the Kong vocal ended up being essentially a real bed of Andy's voice, which was the basis that we built other sounds on top of.
The roars, the big roars, were what needed most backing up from and beefing up from other sources.
Which were then edited by Brent Burge. He augmented them with animal sounds, creature noises of his own making, and voila, King Kong is born.
Most critically, Andy was there for Naomi.
How do they clean that suit, Andy? I bet you it stinks. But in full gorilla style, by the way.
When I got to the set,
I realised how much he was putting into it.
It was vital for Naomi to be able to believe what was going on between her and Kong so that she was not having to make weird character decisions for Kong.
Because otherwise, Kong's performance would end up being an amalgam of my imagination and Naomi's imagination. Everybody should just take their cue from Andy. Andy will do a big throw.
And the first scene that we really played together, which was the cove scene, was quite extraordinary.
Andy, we'll just want you to see, so it's important to get a camera left eye line. Well, I mean, aren't we going to block Andy out? Have we checked this eye line? So there we go, Andy. That's where we are. So
tight up against the box there. Is that good?
You're kind of lowish most of the time during this, aren't you?
I'm down. Yeah, I'm down.
You're at heart rate number 1, and now we're loading up to the heart rate number 2.
And then hit. It was a big, big day for me and for Naomi because it was her first big emotional Kong scene.
I'm sitting in the back of the boat crying. I don't know if Preston's supposed to be crying at that point, but I am. You know, I couldn't help it.
So, you know, I was standing there with my with this big harpoon, and I'm starting like crying, you know, because I can't take it any longer, you know.
After that first scene that really worked between us, it did become a normal way of working, and we really did have an extraordinary bond. As if you were playing a normal kind of relationship on the screen where someone's off camera and someone's being filmed. You nail it every single time because you believe totally in the characters and the situations. No, don't you mock us. No, but...
I love him.
And he looks up at the trees.
I may be tricking my imagination here and believing that I'm working with a gorilla, but it's just a connection between two souls.
We had this problem of Andy being not 25 foot tall. And what we realised is the most important thing he could do was to be placed where Kong's head would be.
I never thought I'd be spending so much time up in a JLG. It has its kind of lonely moments. People forget you're up there sometimes.
Occasionally, Andy would describe what Kong was doing. If there were things that he couldn't physically do, he would be shouting them out.
Push! And now he's picking up a boulder.
Smashing it! Smashing the floor, smashing it!
And then he's going to run towards you and a fist comes down.
Left! Right! He's going berserk!
It never disturbed me. It never made me feel like, oh, now I'm listening to an actor. Because Andy was always in character.
There you go.
He just makes me believe I'm nothing without him. I fell in love, you know, with this creature, and that was important. The story does not work if you don't have that. Beautiful.
The amazing thing with visual effects films is how much of the power of the visual effect depends on the power of the actors who are reacting to it. How strong and powerful they are will ultimately dictate how powerful your creature turns out to be.
I knew that she was receiving what I was able to give her and was using that, and so it was very gratifying for me. And I knew that further down the line, when it came to shoot Kong's reverses on the motion capture stage, we would be locked into the moment.
And cut. Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you very, very much. That is also Naomi and Andy's last shot as well. So. Now your work begins.
We started the motion capturing of Kong after principal photography had finished.
Essentially, Andy had to do everything twice. He filmed the scenes with Naomi during the principal photography, and then months later, he would be doing the other half of the same scene, but he'd be doing it in a special motion capture suit. And we're able to capture his performance so that every movement he made was captured by the computer and able to drive the digital model of Kong.
We had the chance through animation for Peter to direct the previs and sort of get a rough pass at what he wanted Kong to be doing. Now this was our chance to actually work with Andy and get Andy's take on what Kong should be and what he should be doing, and a lot of stuff was born out of that.
Okay, we're going to do a range of motion. We should film this on our master camera.
Basically, every day when we start, we have to do a range of motion, which is like a physical workout for the CG puppet.
Which Andy would make the rest of the crew get up and do with him.
They missed out on the yoga before they came to work. They could do this.
You couldn't not do the range of motion. You had to do the range of motion.
When we started to investigate how we were going to do the motion capture, we realised it was going to be tough. But I didn't realise that actually Gollum was a piece of cake compared to it. Creating Kong was a million times more difficult because of the proportionality.
You know, I mean, Andy's arms are too short to play a gorilla. His legs are too long.
He refuses to get an arm extension surgically done.
I wanted to, but they wouldn't give me the time out to go and get it done.
Easy.
I would have done it, but I'm not paying for it, that's what I'm saying.
If Andy needed to walk on all fours like a gorilla, gorilla's arms are longer than their legs. So we built these special arm extensions that he could walk on all fours. But the problem was he couldn't use his hands because he couldn't then pick them up because his hands were locked into these grips. So if he were doing things where he needed to use his hands a lot, we actually had to build a special platform for him. So he didn't have to bend over as much, but he could use his hands, and then we would extend Kong's arms to touch the ground.
Lots of scenes were achieved with me running along carrying a Barbie. I know you've been watching the animatics, but you've got to put a bit more into it because I just can't do it. All right? You know, sometimes when my kids came down on a Friday afternoon to watch that, I think they must have thought, what is my father doing? He's 41 years old, running around in a monkey suit with dots all over his face and a Barbie. You know, get a job. Here we are. It's just a warehouse, really, but we've converted it into this rather marvellous high-tech space. Nobody's here yet. I'm always the first in because getting facial markers on takes about an hour and a half. Well, me and Tasha, who does the makeup, digital makeup. Gino would be on one side and Tash would be on the other, and Gino had this joke where he'd go, 1, 2, 3. So what do you do in an hour and a half? This is where I get to settle down and watch a good movie.
We'd watch King Kong every morning, the original one.
We'd stick about 132 markers all over my face, along the eyelids, along all the facial muscle groups.
And those dots make particular patterns. And from those patterns, we can figure out what muscles are moving on Andy. Then we can map that to Kong's muscles, and that's how we can transfer the performance. Essentially, Andy's facial muscles are driving Kong's facial muscles.
The effectiveness is really through the eyes.
We can actually figure out which way Andy's eyes are moving just from the motion of these markers, just from the shape changes in the eyelids.
And that is how we've really created the emotional power through the eyes.
The mocap stage is a very, very sterile environment to sort of perform against. There's no set, there's no props.
He's in a black lycra suit, he's got stupid dots on him, he's surrounded by cameras.
There is a sense of loneliness out there, and there were long days.
I always felt sorry for Andy in a way because Andy was left alone to generate his performance.
The scariest times for me was everybody packing up and going home, the cast, and then realising that really the whole characterisation of Kong had yet to be done.
So much of Kong's character was actually being written on the motion capture stage.
Fran and Philippa were down there and you know, they had scenes that they hadn't even written yet that they wanted to explore through Andy.
What we were trying to find was the essence, the true nature of Kong.
He is curious and intelligent and familial. You know, I mean, he wants to be part of a family group. That's his natural instinct.
I mean, he can be angry, he can be aggressive, he can be violent, but what he is at the base is a creature with an enormous heart. He is an honest character, and therefore heroic.
And all of this Andy understood and brought to the character of Kong.
When he was reacting to Naomi, we would play a take that she did on a video monitor for Andy.
And so I played directly to them as an eye line, which is why it was so important to have had that relationship with her on the set. And that's why it feels like they are acting with each other, because they are acting with each other.
Roll sound. And cut.
It gets intense in here, doesn't it? It's intense in here. We love it, but we're all going mad.
God, unbelievable. Hard to think we've been doing this for 8 weeks.
We've kind of really done a first pass. Although we've been doing it for 8 weeks, it feels like we only really discovered the character about 2 weeks ago.
But this is just the beginning for Kong. It's just the beginning for Kong. There's a lot of work to do. The wizards at Weather Digital have still got a lot of work to go, and good luck to them.
I think Carl Denham had an easier job trying to make his movie.
So he just goes for a bit of a jump.
The girl he chases down was originally come from mocap and now has been sort of fairly heavily keyframed.
The motion captured data for Kong was very useful and it formed the basis of Kong's performance. But just because of the physical nature of the character, there were a lot of things that Andy literally couldn't motion capture.
We got Kong on the Empire State Building. Yeah, it was originally mocap, but it wasn't quite monumental enough.
The majority of Kong's performance, there isn't one shot that hasn't come through the animation department. And a lot of the times, you know, shots that were originally intended to be completely motion capture were reanimated.
Motion capture is great if you can nail it. If you have to go in and rework it or modify it, then it becomes very, very difficult to do.
Motion capture is incredibly intensive in the amount of data that it generates because every little twitch of every little part of the body gets recorded.
Because the data is so dense, to make any changes, it became a huge amount of work just to get the film finished. You know, we sort of had to make a few decisions early on that when this stuff came in, how close is it to what Peter wants? If it's dead on, then we should attempt to use it. If he wants, you know, this change and that change to it, we may as well animate it from scratch.
But there was always Andy there as reference, even for the times that motion capture wasn't actually usable to drive the puppet.
Finding Kong within the Andy performance was a combination of animators taking that raw motion capture data and building on it and preserving the performance, but finding Kong within the performance.
Andy brought a consistency that we could all, you know, as animators lock onto. He really showed us who the character was supposed to be.
So it is very much an amalgam. I mean, the final performance of Kong is obviously driven by Andy Serkis, but it's Christian Rivers directing the animation team to deliver the completion of the performance.
The biggest challenge we had on Kong was really not so much that he was digital, but that he was an animal.
Kong only has facial and body expressions and some noise.
And that was a scary thing because it meant that our computer character had to deliver a powerful enough performance to be able to show you his feelings without saying a single word of dialogue.
It almost could be considered an advantage as well, just because the audience can really kind of project their feelings into what he's looking like.
And he has an ability to be driven by Andy's acting performance as well, so that it's the perfect synergy between a human actor and a visual effects computer-generated character.
The ice pond idea came from Philippa and Fran working with Andy on the mocap stage.
I got to be honest, I was a bit skeptical. I was like, oh, crikey, is that getting a little bit... I don't know. I mean, you know, everyone has their own opinions.
A lot of people thought Ice Pond was a bit of a joke and that it would never, ever make the final film.
I remember having to convince the animators that this was going to be a really great sequence.
It did seem like a slightly crazy idea, but it was a brilliant idea because people at that point of the film were just really ready for something to give some happiness to Kong.
And I'm really proud of the sequence. I think the sequence is so beautiful.
The thing that I've come to learn with computer-generated characters is that the most powerful moments are often the stillest, most subtle moments of their performance.
It's the quiet moments that really let you understand the character.
There's this wonderful shot of him feeling very sheepish after he's done this sort of tantrum and smashed up the ruins. And you can see that he's absorbing the fact that somehow there's been this power shift and that she now has power over him. I mean, those moments are the stillest and the most subtle in the whole movie, and obviously some key moments on the Empire State Building as well.
It was those moments, I think, for me, that gave him a reality and a soul.
And of course, so much of it is in the play of the eyes.
Even on his death scene, his face was very still, but we could still motion capture the tiny little movements in the eyelids, how they were just kind of relaxing and going limp.
When the light goes out of those eyes, when Kong loses his life, you see the passing of that soul.
What happens in a film like this, which is kind of scary, but it's just the reality, is that you have a huge amount of time in which you prepare, and it takes you most of that time to simply get one shot looking good for Kong. Like it took us, possibly a year and a half before we had a shot that we liked, a single shot.
Pretty much everything that was done up to that point was development still, rather than actually any kind of production animation.
It's almost like rehearsal, and then when everything's ready, we go into performance mode.
Every single shot that you see in the film was animated at one point or another in that last 6 months.
Doesn't get much tighter than that.
The pressure is really on, and now I'm going to take my coat off because I'm getting kind of hot.
And in the case of Kong, it's something like 900 shots.
I mean, I thought Return of the King was bad in terms of the time frame we had, but this definitely tops it.
So we were pretty busy the last 3 or 4 months.
I'm really, relieved and thankful that I got the chance to make Kong at the end of the day. I mean, people, I think, naturally assume that The Lord of the Rings was probably my big lifetime ambition, but that's actually not the case at all. Kong was the film that I had wanted to make since I was a kid.
If he hadn't seen the original King Kong, I don't know what Peter Jackson would be doing today. He would probably be making models or something like that.
That was a key thing for me, that he had lived with this film in his head since he was 9 years old, and that was what drove him right to this day.
It's the movie that made him want to become a filmmaker.
The original 1933 Kong, I think, has probably inspired more people to become filmmakers or writers or special effects artists or makeup artists than probably any film ever made.
I got Kong out over Christmas and I viewed it at Weta Workshop, and I finished the film and then walked out into their display hall where you have all of their hero swords from LOTR, suits of armour, things from Narnia, all sorts of wonderful, wonderful creations. It really hit me that this is all here. This has been created because of that film that I'd just been watching. And it was like a sledgehammer blow. It was incredible.
And to be working on Peter's remake of that film was really, it's the job of a lifetime.
Just like on Rings, where we said, well, if Tolkien were alive today, he'd probably be happy. And we think that probably if Willis O'Brien were alive today, he'd probably be thrilled and wish that he'd been here with us to do it.
If ever there was a bash-it-together, handmade CG visual effects film, Kong is it.
This is just like the old days.
Pete makes films nowadays just like he did on Braindead. It's just now he has a huge visual effects facility at his disposal.
Yeah, it's his home movie because it's all his home. Universal's biggest picture is Pete's home movie.
Sometimes he's protecting you, like he's running and protecting you here.
With Peter Jackson, the great thing, art is fun. Art is like playing all day round.
You better put on those knee pads, Tomas. You're gonna need them. I think me and Lobo have like a 2-minute fight scene before Tomas comes in. I fight both of them.
In a lot of ways, it was like I was 12 years old, running around in a big backyard,
Pretending like we were doing a thing. and then I come out of the bushes, and I'm King Kong, and you can scream, ah! You know what I mean?
But I don't think he's got the strength. Yeah, he hasn't really got the strength.
I was there on set when he finally got to shoot the Empire State Building. I got chills because I thought when he was a kid he was trying to do this, and now he's sitting there doing it. It's his dream, and that's pretty special to be part of that.
For me, it was also the end of 5 years of being in New Zealand pretty well. It was the end of a big era in my life of being part of creating 2 CG characters.
I've definitely been pleased how he's feeling like a character in his own right. He doesn't feel like any other gorilla we've met before.
No.
The great opportunity that this film has given me is the chance to assist Peter in our small way to help him make this film.
So now I'm thinking jump off a bridge or something right after I'm done with this movie, because it's not going to get any better.
I do feel like I've achieved really what I wanted to achieve when I set out to be a filmmaker when I was, a kid. And so now I can just relax and enjoy myself and have fun from this point on. It sort of feels a little bit like that.